Howdy, all. This is Kyle Whittington. Thank you all for tuning in to watch tonight's debate. As you are probably aware, the resolution is Are the Gospels Anonymous? We have Kevin Non-Tradicath arguing in the affirmative, and we have Dave Paulman arguing in the negative. So let me just go ahead and introduce these guys real quick. Kevin Non-Tradicath is an ex-traditional Catholic, FSSP, current agnostic, in quotations. I wanted to point that out because it's highly nuanced, and is the host of Kevin Non-Tradicath YouTube channel, where he discusses Catholic topics from the perspective of an ex-rad trad ex-Catholic. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering from the New Jersey Institute of Technology and lives in Kentucky. With his wife and his cats. He first gained notoriety online when Catholic apologist and YouTube extraordinaire Kyle Whittington interviewed him, forever branding Kevin as the pleasant apostate, a badge which Kevin wears proudly to this day. I would like to just go ahead and add a note that this does not bode well for Kevin's integrity because you can already see his mischaracterizations. All right. So David Paulman is a Christian apologist and writer. He runs the online apologetics ministry, Faith Because of Reason, and is the founder and host of Christian Evidentialism podcast. He is a member of the Society of Evangelical Arminians and has written articles related to epistemology, apologetics, and theology for websites such as Cross-Examine, Free Thinking Ministries, and Cerebral Faith. He first gained notoriety online when Mr. James White criticized him for working at Dillard's, and the Calvinist community has distinctly disliked him ever since. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to come out and have this debate. I'm sure it's going to be a great time. I do want to go ahead and just go over the format a little bit, and we'll get started here. So, the format, so we're going to have each debater is going to have 15 minutes for opening statements, then 10-minute rebuttals. We're going to do a 20-minute cross-examination, and then we're going to do Q&A for 30 minutes. Now, just a quick note on the Q&A. I am going to prioritize Stoops over just normal chats, and those will be categorized differently. So if you ask them early on, I'll be able to find it really easily on the way back. So once we get there. And then once those are exhausted, then I'll start getting to more of the more recent, just normal chats. And then to close it out, we're going to end with 5-minute closing statements. So, gentlemen, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put Dave away, and Kevin, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Kyle, for having us here. Let me get my slides started. Thank you for hosting me and Dave, and for agreeing, Dave, to do this debate, and Kyle for hosting us. I am thrilled and honored to be here with both of you, and I'm very excited to be taking the affirmative in tonight's debate. In early June, Kyle, David, and I agreed that the prompt for tonight's debate would be "The Gospels are anonymous," which at first filled me with a devious glee. You see, I had planned on just spending roughly 10 hours reading the Gospels from start to finish out loud, pointing out that the Gospels themselves, the actual text, are strictly speaking are anonymous, and then declaring victory. But unfortunately for me, Dave is a wily opponent, and he, within only minutes of agreeing on the prompt, suggested that we agree on what we mean by anonymity. David said a lot of skeptics in his experience tend to define anonymity as an author failing to identify himself by the name in the written body of the text. Obviously, he agrees that the Gospels are anonymous in that sense, so he proposed that we work with this definition. The authors of the Gospels are unknown both to us and to the earliest Christians. He asked if that was acceptable to me, and I dejectedly said that that would be fine. That means I actually have some work to do. Okay, then, let's get down to it. I am going to be defending the prompt that the Gospels are anonymous, not only in the super strict internal anonymity sense of the word, but in the broader, we really don't know who wrote them sense of the word. Let's take a moment to understand the anonymity hypothesis. The anonymity hypothesis states that the Gospels were written in the second half of the first century, and that the traditional names for the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not associated with those texts for about 100 years. Plus or minus a few decades, probably minus a few decades, but still, the general idea is that Mark was written in the 70s, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, John in the 90s, and by 150 AD, still nobody was referring to them by the traditional names. It wasn't until 170-ish that people were calling those texts by the names that we know them today. Irenaeus's Against Heresies was written in like 180, 185-ish, and Irenaeus quotes all of the Gospels by name. So that's like the absolute latest date that somebody could use. And I doubt that Irenaeus came up with that on the spot. So I've kind of just moved like 10, 15 years prior to Irenaeus, stuck the names have stuck delineation at 170 AD and left it there. Data that falls outside of this 170 to 180 range will not affect the anonymity hypothesis at all. Dave and I agree that the gospel names had stuck by the end of the 2nd century. Where we disagree is if the names had stuck before then, in the roughly 100 years between writing and the second half of the 1st century. I will be presenting evidence of anonymity within the late 1st and early 2nd century timeframe in my opening statement, and I suspect that Dave won't disagree with the evidence that I present. Where we will probably disagree, though, is what we should make of the evidence. If there's one thing worth mentioning more about the anonymity hypothesis before I start presenting the evidence, it's that the anonymity hypothesis is the clear scholarly consensus on the authorship of the Gospels. How do I know that? Well, since this is a Catholic channel here, I will first appeal to a Catholic author, Dr. Brant Petrie. On page 13 of The Case for Jesus, Dr. Petrie calls the anonymity hypothesis, quote, so widespread that it was hardly ever discussed. Apologies for the terrible looking screenshot. I took that from my own book. Thank you, Kyle, for sending the book to me. The Catholic Encyclopedia, which bears the nihil obstat, admits that, quote, the first 4 historical books of the New Testament are supplied with titles which, however ancient, do not go back to the respective authors of those sacred writings. My favorite scholar of the New Testament, Father Raven Brown, was a Catholic priest, and his monumental work, An Introduction to the New Testament, suggests that the Gospels are likely anonymous as well, just like the Catholic Encyclopedia. And this work also bears the nihil obstat. You know what's truly terrible, though, is that some of you in the audience might not be Catholic. Dave and I might not even be Catholic, so we might not care what Catholics say. If that is the case, then I should appeal to the long list of non-Catholic Christian scholars and secular scholars who all affirm that the Gospels are anonymous. Here are some quotes from some non-Catholic Christian scholars from Union Theological Seminary and Fuller Theological Seminary, as well as secular scholars from Yale and Seton Hall. I know that Seton Hall is a Catholic school, but it's secular. Trust me, half my family went there. I can keep going listing scholars all day who support anonymity, but I'd be more or less wasting my time. Kinda. It is true that the appeal to popularity and the appeal to authority are fallacies. But I don't think it's entirely a waste of time, because I think that this should give at least the not super well-informed traditional author supporting Christian pause. I'm thinking of my past self here. I grew up kind of not even thinking about the authorship of the Gospels, but I definitely did hold to the traditional authorship view until I really got into the textual criticism. I do not think that my past self should have said, oh, wow, look how popular this theory is, it must be right. But the popularity among experts should have, and indeed did, prompt me to look into it further. That's what we will be doing with the rest of my opening statement, looking into it further. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. This is how I see the evidence on both sides of the argument, though I will not be responding to the counter arguments on the right-hand side of this screen until my rebuttal. Also note that I will be spending no time at all talking about the internal anonymity of these books, since Dave and I already agreed that the Gospels are internally anonymous, strictly speaking. I will be spending the vast majority of my time talking about the church fathers, and I should really be saying the apostolic fathers, because these are the church fathers of the 1st and 2nd century. Let's start with the Didache. Our first example of early Christian writing treating the Gospels as being anonymous is the Didache. The Didache is considered part of a group of 2nd-generation Christian writings known as the Apostolic Fathers, even though the Didache itself is anonymous. This work was considered by some of the Apostolic Fathers to be part of the New Testament, and the Didache might be older than the Gospel of John. This treatise shares phrases and content found particularly in the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, chapter 8 of the Didache quotes the Lord Prayer as written in Matthew 6, 9-13, and indeed attributes it to a written source, but not Matthew. Instead, the Didache refers to this written source as his gospel, his referring to the Lord, so the Lord's gospel, without providing attribution to the disciple Matthew. Elsewhere, the Didache also refers to the gospel of the Lord and the ordinances of the gospels. Again, these are anonymous attributions, no mention whatsoever of any of the four traditional authors. This supports the view that when the gospels were first circulated, they were circulating anonymously. First Clement is one of the most ancient non-biblical Christian texts that we have besides the Didache. First Clement may also be older than the Gospel of John. While the authorship of First Clement is debated, and while the letter is technically internally anonymous, it doesn't matter. First Clement provides us with a late first century quote of the Gospels, which does not attribute the traditional author. First Clement 13:2 clearly quotes from either Luke 6 or Matthew 7. It's not clear because of the synoptic problem. But do not judge lest ye be judged. But again, only referring to it as the words of the Lord Jesus. Second Clement does the same thing. Now, Second Clement, probably not written by the same person who wrote First Clement, but again, it doesn't matter. Second Clement is also very early, and Second Clement also refers to, it quotes from what we would call the Gospels, but it never says Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Ignatius of Antioch quotes word for word the synoptics at some point in the first half of the second century in his letter to the Romans, again, anonymously. Now, this quote actually comes from Mark 8, Matthew 16, and Luke 9. Again, the synoptic problem here. But Ignatius doesn't quote Matthew or Mark or Luke here. In fact, he kind of just quotes it without mentioning it at all. Like he doesn't say even the Lord says or the words of the Lord or anything like that. But still, another anonymous attribution to the Gospels in the first half of the second century. Then there's Polycarp, who does the exact same thing as Clement and Ignatius and the Didache, referring to something that we would recognize as coming from the synoptics, but Polycarp never mentions the author's name, only referring to it as, quote, the words which the Lord spoke. We'll do one more church apostolic father, and I view this apostolic father as kind of the tail end of what I'll refer to as like the anonymity era. That would be Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr makes repeated, unmistakable references to the content found in the Gospels, but not once does he name any of the four evangelists for authorship or source attribution when he quotes from this material. Never. He instead refers to these writings as a single volume that he just generically dubs the Memoirs of the Apostles, treating the Apostles as some unitary source. In all of Justin's voluminous writings, he never delineates or otherwise distinguishes the memoirs by name. But Justin does typically treat his other sources quite differently. Justin always cites the memoirs as being anonymous, but he does quote other sacred scripture by name. For example, Justin quotes Zechariah, Malachi, and the Psalms from the Old Testament. He also quotes from non-biblical sources, such as Esdras and the letter of Jeremiah. And finally, he quotes pagan authors by name, namely Plato and Pythagoras. Still, whenever Justin quotes or otherwise references the content taken from the Memoirs of the Apostles, he makes not a single mention of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John as sources. This is weird, and it's evidence that those specific names were not yet attached to the Gospels at the time of Justin's writings, which was 150, 155. A common understanding among scholars and theologians is that Justin's memoirs were probably a compilation of the four Gospels. Yet, experts in the patristics have noted that these memoirs feature some curious peculiarities. For instance, there's one occasion when Justin says that he is citing from the Memoirs of the Apostles, and he's talking about when Jesus is baptizing people in the River Jordan, but he mentions that the River Jordan catches on fire while Jesus is in there. That's not in our gospel. But it does, it's a clue. It's saying that something funny is going on in the first century. This should all be painting a picture, but let's look at some non-apostolic father evidence while I still have a little bit of time left in my opening statement. Let's move on to the synoptic problem, perhaps more accurately referred to as the synoptic puzzle, because it's not really a problem, it's a puzzle. But regardless, I think that the synoptic puzzle does give us good reason to think that the people who the Gospels are named after did not write the Gospels. If Mark was recording Peter's testimony, if Luke was recording what he had heard from Paul, who had heard from the 12, and if Matthew was literally an eyewitness, it would be kind of weird if we saw this like super high degree of literary interdependence. Yet this is exactly what we see. only about 3% of Mark is uniquely Markan, 20% of Matthew is uniquely Matthean, and 35% of Luke is uniquely Lucan. Maybe Luke gets a pass for being like third hand instead of like second hand or first hand. But Matthew and Mark are like super dependent on each other. And for now, I'm not even talking about who copied from who. It doesn't really matter for here because Dave and I will disagree on who copied from who, but it doesn't really matter for the point that I'm trying to illustrate right now. I think it's super, super weird that Mark is essentially just writing down what Peter tells him to write down. And Matthew is literally an eyewitness. And 76% of what is found in Mark is found in Matthew. Like, I'm sorry, no, it's actually like 97% or whatever, because Mark and Matthew share that red, and then the purple is the triple tradition shared by all three. So just super weird, and that's just not something that I would expect to find if the Gospels were really written by who we say that they were written by. I think that the original language of the Gospels also kind of poses a problem for trad authorship. Galilean fishermen would not have been super literate, and Acts does specifically call Peter and John illiterate, at least, so that covers John Gospels, but Peter didn't write Mark, right? Mark wrote Mark. So maybe Mark wrote Mark because Peter was illiterate. Well, Acts 2:12 says that after Peter escaped from Herod's jail cell, he went to Mark's mom's house in Galilee. So Herod ruled over the land that's colored in that picture on the slide here. So Herod wasn't the ruler of super literate places. So Mark was probably also illiterate, regardless of his occupation, just because he lived in that area on that map there. I think that Matthew was illiterate too, and this is a pretty common approach to the problem as well, because Matthew was a tax collector, not the kind of guy who actually crunched the numbers. He wasn't like an accountant sitting there with like an ancient Excel spreadsheet. He was the guy who went door to door, like knocking on your door saying like, give me the money. So not like a highbrow job. This was like a low class job. Luke might have the best shot at being a real author from the language perspective, since he was a doctor and he hung out with Paul, who was like super educated. So I'll exempt Luke from this criticism, but I still think that the traditional, the real language of the Gospels poses a problem for traditional authorship, albeit a smaller problem than the previous things that I've said. Lastly, I think that there are some dating tensions here. This is not insurmountable by any stretch of the imagination, but they would have been written when the authors were really old, and that's kind of weird. So what do I think that the Gospels were called? I think they were called the Gospel of the Lord. Take a look at Mark chapter 1, verse 1. It reads like a title, the Gospel of Jesus Christ. It would be kind of weird if it was like the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Jesus Christ. I just think that's kind of weird. But anyway, that wraps up my opening statement. Thanks for listening to me nerd out. I'm really looking forward to listening to Dave's opening, to our rebuttals, to the cross-examination, and to everything else. Thank you very much.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. So, all right. So next up, I'm going to have Dave on. While I did that, I noticed that there was just a slight I didn't time it quite right. I'm getting the timing started. So Dave, I'm going to just that if you're ready to start, I will begin now.
Okay. All right, so modern New Testament scholarship overwhelmingly affirms the thesis that the four canonical Gospels were written anonymously, but I disagree with this. I think that the arguments for this idea are flawed and that the evidence strongly supports the thesis that our Gospels always carried the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John right from the beginning. So I'm defending the negative position in this debate. I'm defending the proposition that the Gospels are not anonymous. And more specifically, I'm defending the proposition that the Gospels were indeed written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, observe that it's not actually necessary for the sake of this debate that the traditional attributions of authorship be correct, even if the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are pseudonyms. As long as these names were attached to the Gospels from the beginning, then the anonymity thesis is defeated. Nevertheless, positive evidence for the genuineness of the traditional authorship provides a rebutting defeater for the anonymity thesis. But we need to begin by defining precisely what we mean by anonymity. According to some, a document is anonymous just in case the author does not identify themselves by name in the body of written text. Clearly, the Gospels are anonymous by this definition. But then, so are many other books, such as The Lord of the Rings, even though the author is clearly known. For this debate, I'll be using the term anonymity of the Gospels to refer to the idea that the original authors of the Gospels are unknown either to us or to the original recipients of the Gospels. So I'm going to be using three categories of evidence to argue against the idea that the Gospels are anonymous. First, I'll be arguing that the titles of these documents in the manuscript tradition provide strong evidence against their anonymity. Second, I shall argue that there is early and weighty testimonial evidence identifying these authors, which challenges the anonymity thesis. And finally, I shall argue that there are internal clues within the Gospels themselves, which confirm the external evidence. Perhaps the most obvious evidence for the traditional authorship comes from the very titles which these documents unanimously have in virtually all extant copies where a title is present. Almost without exception, they are titled as the Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. While the anonymity thesis holds that these titles were added in the late 2nd century, there is in fact no manuscript evidence to support this. We possess no anonymous copies, and P1 is the possible exception here, which I'll be happy to discuss later if Kevin wants to. The idea that the titles were a later addition is implausible, since as soon as more than one gospel was written, the early Christians would need a way to tell them apart. As Brant Petrie says, quote, to suggest that no titles whatsoever were added to the Gospels until the late 2nd century AD completely fails to take into account the fact that multiple Gospels were already circulating before Luke ever set pen to papyrus, and that there would be a practical need to identify these books, end quote. Another piece of evidence which is telling against the anonymity thesis is the presence of literary dependence among the Synoptic Gospels. It seems unlikely that the Synoptic Gospels, Luke in particular, would have depended upon one another if their authors were unknown. Simon Gathercole, for example, says, it is one thing to assume that Christians in a 1st century congregation would simply have taken on trust what they heard read out without asking the says who question. It is a considerable step beyond that to suppose that a professionally conscientious investigator like Luke would, without any accompanying testimony, follow a naked anonymous account. In my estimation, the most compelling evidence both against the anonymity thesis as well as in favor of the traditional authorship comes from the external attribution of the Gospels to these authors by early Christians. The 4 Gospels are consistently attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by Papias, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, and St. Augustine. These witnesses were spread over a wide geographical space, making it unlikely that they were all pulling from one another. Their independence is further seen in the fact that there are some apparent contradictions between them with respect to when the Gospels were written and possibly the order in which they were written. Some explanation is needed for the unanimous voice with which the ancient church names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors of their Gospels. Now, I know that Kevin primarily wants to discuss evidence which is prior to 170 AD because, in his opinion, that's when the names kind of stuck with the Gospels. Now, of the sources I've cited, only Papias is uncontroversially prior to 170, writing probably sometime between 90 and 110. Furthermore, he only uncontroversially bears witness to Mark and Matthew as the authors of their respective Gospels. Now, that alone challenges the anonymity of at least Matthew and Mark, but, when have I ever been known not to become controversial? I'm going to take a much more radical position, maintaining that Papias actually does bear witness to the authorship of John and even to Luke as well. For example, consider this often neglected fragment in the anti-Marcionite prologue to John. It cites Papias as saying that John the Apostle authored the 4th Gospel. Now, it's true that the prologue contains some dubious historical information. Importantly, however, the prologue is not the source of this information, for the prologue is merely passing on information obtained from Papias. So Papias, rather than the prologue, is the source. I guess the diehard skeptic can maintain that the prologue, or the author of the prologue, just sort of made this up and attributed it to Papias and said, hey, Papias said this, even though he never did. But that seems unlikely in light of the fact that Papias's books were still available at that time. The references could have been checked. And he gives actually a very specific reference to Book 5. And so it doesn't seem like he would do that if Papias hadn't actually said that. So we have strong reasons for thinking that Papias told us that John the Apostle also wrote the Gospel of John. It gets even better, though. Ecclesiastical History 3:24, 5-13. Here Eusebius mentions a, quote, record, which recounts the history of the writing of the 4 Gospels. Now, Eusebius doesn't name the source of this record, but a literary analysis by Charles Hill demonstrates close parallels between what Eusebius says about Matthew and Mark and what Papias says about Matthew and Mark. And this shows that Papias' source here is plausibly Papias. So in Ecclesiastical History 2:15-1, Eusebius explains the origin of Mark's gospel, which he refers to as the Recollections of Peter. He cites both Papias and Clement as his sources. So these are our 2 most promising candidates for Eusebius' source when he revisits the topic in Book 3. And we know from Clement's own writings that he had read Papias. So Papias seems to be the true source of this information. It's therefore much more likely that Papias is depending upon, or rather that Eusebius is depending upon Papias here. As Hill concludes, quote, "It is hard for me to believe that an independent source on the origins of the four Gospels would share all of these characteristics with the account of the origins of Matthew and Mark explicitly attributed to Papias. If Hill is correct, then Papias names all four Gospel authors." One could ask why Eusebius doesn't name his source here, but the answer there is pretty clear. Eusebius just didn't like Papias and tried to distance him from the Apostle John whenever he could. So that's probably why he didn't name him here. I also would want to draw our attention to the witness of Irenaeus. His witness to the four traditional authors of the Gospels and against heresies is commonly dated between 174 and 189, but I think it could be dated earlier than that. Regardless of when we date it, Irenaeus is unlikely to be the first person attributing them to these four people. And I'm actually in agreement with Charles Hill here as well, who his literary analysis of against heresies shows that this presbyter that Irenaeus constantly cites is very likely actually Polycarp. And if that's correct, then we actually have not only Irenaeus passing on an earlier tradition, but then this means the Gospels are not anonymous by the lights of Polycarp. And this seems very likely, especially when we consider what Irenaeus tells us in his letter to Florinius. Here he recounts about the times where he went to see Polycarp as a young man. And the reports, what he says there about Polycarp matches actually very well with what he says about how he received his gospel tradition. So I think there's a strong case that Polycarp is Irenaeus' source. And the upshot of that also is that Polycarp that Irenaeus and Papias are going to be independent of one another. So that's, two independent sources attesting to the traditional authorship of the gospel. On a related note, we've got internal clues that, internal evidence that I think is very compelling for traditional authorship. So it's very difficult to see, for example, why anyone would want to invent Mark and Luke as the authors of the Gospels, which bear their names, as neither of them would have been an eyewitness, and neither was particularly prominent in the early church. Matthew, whose Gospel is the most Jewish in style, would be a pretty odd choice as well to invent as being an author. This is just because Matthew is identified as a tax collector for the Romans within the Gospel. And we know the Jews weren't terribly fond of these individuals, so it'd be strange and really counterproductive to invent a tax collector as being the author of a gospel which is directed towards a largely Jewish audience. This evidence is very easily explained if we posit that the synoptics were attributed to Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they actually wrote them. Very difficult to imagine why these names were selected if they didn't actually belong to the authors. Several other internal considerations render anonymity improbable. For example, the author of the Gospel of Matthew has a penchant for money. He goes out of his way to, include parables that have money in them. He goes out of his way to mention the specific names of the types of coins that he mentions in his narrative. And just a lot of uniquely Matthean material emphasizes money. I don't think it's a mere coincidence that the one gospel which shows a greater interest in money than the others is the same one which is attributed to a tax collector. Mark's gospel mentions Peter a lot more than the others. Indeed, in many parallel stories where the other gospels will just mention the disciples, Mark will mention Peter. After the resurrection in Mark, the young man at the tomb tells the woman to tell the disciples and Peter that the Lord will meet them soon. This harmonizes nicely with the substantial amount of testimony that Peter was Mark's mentor and that Peter's preaching formed the basis for Mark's gospel. And another point to mention here as well is if you look at Peter's sermon in Acts, the structure of that is very similar to the structure that we find in Mark. So there's kind of a plausible connection there that if Acts is giving us an accurate picture of what Peter's preaching looked like, then very plausibly Mark would be that as well. So that harmonizes very well with the external evidence there. The author of Luke's gospel was almost certainly known, for the author addresses Theophilus by name in the preface. Theophilus was likely the patron for whom the Gospel of Luke was written, though there's some debate about that, what Theophilus means. But most scholars, I think, believe that this is actually a person for whom the Gospel is written. It's scarcely conceivable that Theophilus did not know who was writing this Gospel to him. As Harold Riley puts it, quote, whatever may be true of Matthew and Mark, Luke was certainly not published anonymously. No one writes to a named person, Theophilus, and says, "It seemed good to me to write," without letting it be known who the writer is, end quote. It is also quite unlikely that the author of the Gospel of John was unknown. The author is identified as the disciple whom Jesus loved in John 21:24. Okay, so let's bring all this evidence that I've put forward here into perspective now, because I want to compare this to the genuinely anonymous book of Hebrews. Hebrews provides an interesting test case because it's an uncontroversially anonymous, canonical, biblical book. So it can tell us what we should expect our evidence to look like when we're dealing with an anonymous book. We have, ancient manuscripts and ancient sources, which attribute Hebrews to nobody. We have ones which attribute it to Paul. We find it attributed to Timothy, and we find it attributed to Luke. So what should we expect from an anonymous text? Well, we should expect to find anonymous copies. We should expect to find disagreement over, in the external sources over who wrote it. But we just don't have this, in the case of the Gospels. Again, with that one possible exception in the case of the manuscript evidence for the Gospel of Matthew, whenever the manuscripts of the Gospels include titles, they're without exception attributed to the same four authors. The external witnesses agree that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the authors. And this is just not what we should expect from documents which were originally anonymous if we're sort of taking the book of Hebrews as, if we're using that to calibrate our expectations for what anonymous books should look like. Again, I know Gaius of Rome is going to be the one exception that people want to bring up here and say that, Gaius of Rome is somebody who allegedly attributed the fourth gospel to Cerinthus in the 2nd century. I think that the evidence does not support that. I'm happy to get into that later if Kevin wants to and, camp out on the Gaius of Rome issue. But at any rate, it's far from clear that Gaius of Rome presents a genuine counterexample of this. Not, all scholars. It's not just as straightforward as, oh yeah, Gaius said that Cerinthus wrote the Gospel of John. That's really got to be put together from several different pieces of evidence. And I would argue that that's not the best interpretation of them. Okay, so I've argued that 3 lines of evidence challenge the anonymity hypothesis. First, the manuscript evidence shows no trace that the Gospels were ever anonymous. Second, the external attributions of the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John shows that the authors were indeed known. Third, there are internal clues which square well with the external testimonial evidence. And finally, I've argued that the book of Hebrews provides a good test case for what we should expect the evidence to look like in the case of a truly anonymous canonical book, and that the evidence in the case of the Gospels looks quite different from the evidence in the case of Hebrews. So taken as a whole, I think that provides a robust case against the anonymity hypothesis. Moreover, I think that it strongly supports the trustworthiness of the traditional attributions to the apostles and to their followers. And I look forward to discussing these reasons with Kevin, in the back and forth. So thank you.
All right. So you're going to yield the rest of your time then?
I will, yeah.
Sweet. Okay. All right. So for the next part, we are going to go into 10-minute rebuttals. I see that Kevin's already loaded and ready to go. So, Kevin, I will start the timer whenever you start talking.
All right. Thank you, Dave, for that awesome opening statement. Here are the rebuttals, and we did share opening statements first. That's why I have slides prepared. So I will be responding to these 3 lines of evidence that Dave brought up: the manuscript evidence, church father attributions, and then some internal evidence in that order. Also in that order, in the amount of time that I'm going to spend on it. There's a lot. Let's jump right into it. So first, we're going to start with the manuscript evidence. Now, not a lot of people know what Dr. Petrie looks like, but this is actually a picture of Dr. Petrie that I pulled from his LinkedIn. He doesn't do public debates or conversations. So whatever, Dr. Petrie, but I did want to show his picture for everybody here. And that is his catchphrase too. You're finished. And why did I have Dr. Petrie saying you're finished? Well, because this page, and I realize that my face is covering it, but this is page 16 from Dr. Brant Petrie's The Case for Jesus. And this is the page that a lot of people like to point to when they're trying to argue for trad authorship of the Gospels. They point to it and they say, look at all of these manuscripts. Every single last one of these really early manuscripts that Dr. Petrie points out in this table has the traditional authorship title attached to it. And that's kind of true. And this makes Christians say, hell yeah, brother, when they see this list. They love the list. It's kind of true, but there's kind of a problem with this list. Remember what the anonymity hypothesis is. It's that we know that the trad names were attached sometime in the latter half of the 2nd century. That before then the Gospels were treated anonymously, and the date that I'm using for tonight is 170, but we can move that anyway. But fun fact, in the case for Jesus, Dr. Petrie doesn't explain the anonymity hypothesis. Besides, modern scholars think that they're anonymous, and that's it. Petrie doesn't bring up the Didache, Clement, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, any of that. I digress. We only care about the information under 170. That's what I've highlighted here. Let's take a look at that table of manuscripts again and see how many of them are from the 2nd century and earlier. I've crossed out all of the manuscripts that Dr. Petrie lists as not being from the 2nd century at all, since I would fully expect for any manuscript in the 3rd century and later to have the trad titles on them, even under the anonymity hypothesis. From the 3rd century forward, Dave and I agree that we would expect the manuscripts to bear the trad titles. Why does Dr. Petrie include so many manuscripts from the 3rd, 4th, and even 5th centuries on page 16? I don't know. One reason I can think of is that it just looks really impressive, and it is like a real testament to the amount of manuscripts that we've uncovered, which is an awesome feat of archaeological accomplishment. But notice that we only have 5 manuscripts listed here as being from the 2nd century, and Papyrus 75 is listed twice, once for Luke and once for John. So it's kind of only 4 manuscripts, depending on, how you parse it. But Dr. Petrie also appears to have been really generous in his dating. In particular, Papyrus 62 seems really fairly conclusively dated to the 4th century, but Dr. Petrie lists it as being 2nd century, not even 2nd to 4th like he does for some others. Papyrus 4, the first one that he lists here, seems to have been dated sometime from the very tail end of the 2nd century to the 4th century. But again, Dr. Petrie just lists it as being 2nd century. And again, we know that by the tail end of the 2nd century, we would expect the trad names to have been applied. Okay, let's take a look at these 4 papyruses and put them on that chart that I've been kind of like working with. Look, they are all after 170. None of them really move the needle for me. I assigned Papyrus 4 a really generous date of 180 here, and that still doesn't move the anonymity hypothesis. By the way, putting it at 180 puts it right in line with Irenaeus, which I don't think that this Papyrus 4 is as old as Irenaeus. But regardless, there's one more manuscript that I wanted to bring up, and I saw the chat talking about it already. Dave mentioned it once, and it's Papyrus 1. Dave and I might think that we have a lot to talk about here. We might actually not have a whole lot to talk about here. I just wanted to present it as a possible counter. So Papyrus 1 is dated to like 250 AD, so that's 3rd century. The picture on this slide is page 1 of Papyrus 1. Notice at the top of the page, there's an alpha. It's probably kind of hard to see, but there's an alpha right at the top of the page. That is how the Greeks would write, like that's like number 1 pretty much. Like this is page 1. This is page alpha. This is the first page. Notice that there's no title at the top. I suspect that there was a title somewhere on Papyrus 1 and that title has been lost. There's a couple different possibilities. So the first one is that Papyrus 1 had like a cover, like a title page, a totally separate page that probably had in real big writing. It might have said like, the gospel kata Matthew or whatever. And we just lost that page. That's a possibility. Something that I think is actually more likely though is, so consider for instance, the Apocryphon of John in the Nag Hammadi library. The title to that version, to that manuscript, is actually at the end of the manuscript. And we don't have the end of Papyrus 1. I suspect that Papyrus 1 has a title on it somewhere it's lost, so we don't have it. But I suspect that it used to be there. I just think it's funny though that Papyrus 1 is, one papyrus that we have that doesn't have the manuscript, and Dr. Petrie completely omitted it from the case for Jesus, which I just kind of thought was like a little funny. Like, okay. Anyway, next up, I'd like to talk about the church fathers. I actually almost decided to make my slide look like this because it's kind of only one church father, Papias, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about Polycarp for like 2 seconds. So here we go, Papias time. So this is from Church History, Book 3, Chapter 39, verses 14 to 16. By the way, Church History is like one of the only places that we actually have Papias, because we don't actually have Papias anymore. We have Eusebius. Anyway, these are the lines that people use to hold to trad authorship. What do you notice here? Papias never actually quotes from the Gospels of Mark or Matthew. So we have no method of knowing what books Papias was talking about. He's talking about so Mark wrote something, Matthew wrote something, and he doesn't quote for them. So what if Mark and Matthew wrote something completely separate than what we call Mark and Matthew? We wouldn't know from what Papias tells us. And then look at what else he says about Mark and Matthew. This doesn't look like he's talking about our Mark and our Matthew. Let's talk about why this doesn't look like our Mark and our Matthew. We'll start with Mark. This doesn't sound like our Mark. First of all, Papias calls it a logia, a sayings gospel, as opposed to an euangelion. When you see the Greek word logia, you should be thinking of the gospel of Thomas, not the gospel of Mark that we know and love. Mark is an euangelion, a good news gospel. Papias says that Mark wrote in, quote, no specific order, which does not track with our Mark. Our Mark is not in no specific order. It's not like we get the Last Supper and then the wedding feast at Cana and then the Ascension and then the crucifixion and then the baptism in the River Jordan. No, our Mark is chronologically ordered. Papias says that Mark left nothing out, which doesn't make sense in the fact that our Mark is the shortest gospel. This would be a particularly weird claim if Papias also knew about the Matthew that we have, since our Matthew is so much longer than our Mark. Okay, Matthew next. Papias again refers to this as a logia, not an euangelion. I'll talk more about what a logia is on the next slide, but maybe what's even weirder is that he says it was written in Hebrew. Now, the word that he uses here is dialecto. It means the Hebrew language, or maybe like the Hebrew tongue. A lot of people think that dialecto might have meant like a Hebrew dialect of Greek, which would make more sense because we know that it was written in Greek. Some people think that Hebraise, that word before dialecto, actually means like a Hebrew dialect of Greek. I'm sorry. It means that it might have been written in Aramaic instead of Greek. But I find that more plausible than it being written in Hebrew. But again, Papias does say Hebrew, not Aramaic. We have really good reason to think that Matthew was originally written in Greek too. Consider Matthew 27:46. The Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew literally translates from Aramaic into Greek. So it would be like super weird if he like translated from Hebrew from Aramaic. Like, like that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay, this is a logia, a sayings gospel, the gospel of Thomas. Notice how it's just sayings in no particular order, and that there's no narrative to speak of, no plot. It's just, these are the secret sayings of the living Jesus, which Thomas wrote down. Jesus said, whoever finds inspiration of these sayings will not experience that. Jesus said, let him who continues seeking, Jesus said. His disciples questioned him, and Jesus responded. That's a logia. There are other logia out there, such as the Dialogues of the Savior, which is another apocryphal work dated to the 2nd century, like 150 AD. Some scholars who hold to Q think that Q was probably a logia. But anyway, this is a logia. It's in no particular order. That is what Papias calls Matthew and Mark. But our Matthew and Mark are an euangelion. For more, please see these pages from Father Brown's An Introduction to the New Testament. This brings us to Polycarp. Polycarp, so some people like to say that Polycarp knew John, and so John definitely wrote the gospel. That's not entirely how the argument goes. I don't think it's super clear that Polycarp knew John, because the martyrdom of Polycarp, which is basically a fawning eulogy of him, never makes any mention to John. Lastly, we have the internal evidence. Unfortunately, I'm out of time. We'll have to get to all of this stuff in the cross-examination. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the cross-examination.
All right, excellent. Okay, so thank you, Kevin. Dave, so you have this is going off of my face. Okay, hold on. All right, excellent. Okay, so Dave, you have 10 minutes to respond, and I will start the timer as soon as you start talking.
Cool. All right. So let me begin by thanking Kevin for his well-written and well-informed opening statement. I appreciate him attempting to argue for the thesis that the Gospels were originally anonymous instead of assuming that. As I understand Kevin's case, he made 5 distinct arguments for Gospel anonymity and a 6th quasi-argument from scholarly consensus. I say quasi-argument because he admitted to some of the problems with this argument, but I'd like to address it anyway. I'm not anti-scholarship, but I think that when it comes to New Testament scholarship in particular, there's some pervasive methodological problems, which just sort of are throughout the entire practice. And this sort of mitigates against the significance of scholarly opinion in that particular field for me. For that reason, scholarly consensus in the field of New Testament studies just it doesn't count for as much as it might in another field. The shifting stands of scholarly opinion just don't inspire any confidence that they're tracking the truth. As my favorite philosopher, Timothy McGrew, says, quote, "The changing winds of fashion have never seemed to me to be a good reason for abandoning anything. Popularity is a rotten test for truth," end quote. Okay, so perhaps Kevin's most interesting argument comes from the supposed anonymity of the Gospels in the earliest Christian tradition. Kevin adduces various examples in the Didache, Clement, and Polycarp where the Gospels are quoted, but the traditional authors are not named as evidence that the Gospels were originally anonymous. Unfortunately, Kevin fails to realize that there's a critical distinction between merely not mentioning an author's name when quoting them and treating a writing as anonymous. But these are just clearly not the same thing. In the examples cited in his opening statement, Kevin only shows that the early church sometimes quoted the Gospels without naming the authors, but they never so much as hint that the authors are unknown, and we can see proof of this, in the writings of Irenaeus. Irenaeus uncontroversially believes that the Gospels have been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and yet he sometimes quotes them without citing their names. For example, against Heresies 433, he clearly quotes Matthew 7:1-2, but only attributes it to the Lord. Irenaeus is not thereby treating Matthew's gospel anonymously. Therefore, Kevin's main argument amounts to being an argument from silence, which is a fallacy. Moreover, I think that Kevin has overlooked some pertinent facts within these Gospels, which actually challenge his thesis. For while these fathers do not name the authors of the Gospels, they still cite them with authority. An interesting question may therefore be raised as to why these early Christians regarded these Gospels as so authoritative. At least one obvious explanation is that these Gospels were regarded as authoritative because it was widely known that they had originated with the apostles and their followers. For example, if I say, "All that glitters is not gold," without citing the source, I'm not treating William Shakespeare's writings anonymously. Rather, I'm assuming that my audience is familiar with this famous quotation and where it came from. Similar considerations apply to the Apostolic Fathers. They didn't name their sources in these instances because they took it for granted that their audiences already knew where it was coming from and why it was authoritative. On the anonymity hypothesis, however, it's not at all clear why the Apostolic Fathers should have felt licensed to quote these Gospels with such authority in the first place. Furthermore, Kevin does not discuss Papias, who was a contemporary of Clement and Polycarp, and who clearly does name the authors of Matthew and Mark, possibly as early as the 90s AD. And as I noted in my opening statement, I think there's a good case to be made that he also names Luke and John. Moreover, in this passage, Papias claims to be passing on an earlier tradition even than himself, which he received from the elder John. And this pushes the names for Matthew and Mark, at least, well into the first century. And if Polycarp was Irenaeus' source, as I've argued in my opening, then Polycarp also certainly knows the Gospels and so is not a genuine example of somebody who is treating the Gospels anonymously. Things get more interesting when we come to Justin Martyr. So Kevin's argument here, it's still technically an argument from silence. It's not as flawed, though, because he's pairing it with this sort of inductive argument based upon Justin's other writings, according to which Justin always cites his sources by names. So I think that's a much better example to support the anonymity thesis than the other examples that he used. But unfortunately for Kevin, I think that Justin does betray knowledge of the authorship of the Gospels. For example, he says that the Gospels were written by the apostles and their followers. So this means that at least 2 Gospels have to be written by apostles, presumably Matthew and Mark, and at least 2 have to be written by their followers, Mark and Luke. If the identities of these authors had been unknown to Justin, it's very difficult to explain how he knew that at least 2 had been written by apostles and at least 2 by their followers. Moreover, the fact that this perfectly matches up with our fourfold gospel tradition in Irenaeus and later, well, that just has to be chalked up to a happy coincidence on the anonymity hypothesis. But things get even worse. In Dialogue with Trypho, chapter 106, Justin names the source of one of the memoirs. He refers to the memoirs of Peter and says that it records Jesus changing the names of the sons of Zebedee to the sons of thunder. So the source of at least one of these memoirs was indeed associated with the name Peter. Interesting also is the fact that the term sons of thunder only occurs in the Gospel of Mark, which just so happens to be associated with the memories of Peter by every single church father who spoke on the origin of Mark. Coincidence? I think not. Justin shows us that he does know something about the sources of the Gospels. I'm going to agree with Kevin that it is really odd that Justin does not name these sources in light of his tendency to do that elsewhere, but I think that his naming of Peter, as well as his mentioning of the apostles and their followers as the sources of these memoirs, provides just too much counter evidence to conclude that Justin thought that the Gospels were anonymous. Okay, the synoptic problem, or more accurately, the presence of literary dependence among the synoptics, it poses no problem for the hypothesis of traditional authorship. If, as I believe, Matthew wrote his gospel first, and I'm more than happy to argue for that, we would expect Luke to utilize it, given Luke's explicit claim that he got his information from eyewitnesses. Indeed, I would be surprised if Luke did not use the Gospel of Matthew as a source. I believe that Peter very likely used both Matthew and Luke in his own preaching. Thus, when Mark composed his gospel, I think he did so by stitching together those portions of Matthew and Luke, which Peter had utilized. And this fits pretty well with the internal evidence of conflation that's present within the Gospel of Mark. It's also completely in accord with what all of the church fathers, with the exception of Origen and the early Augustine, tell us about the order and authorship of the Gospels. If Matthew really was written by Matthew and was written first, we would expect Luke and Mark to consult his Gospel for information. Kevin objects that the first language of Jesus' disciples would have been Aramaic rather than Greek. So it's somewhat surprising on the hypothesis of traditional authorship that our Gospels are written in Greek. Strictly speaking, this doesn't actually support the case for anonymity because all of the Gospels, they could, still not be anonymous, even if it were the case that even if they weren't actually written by the traditional authors, right? Because they could still have had these names attached to them like as pseudonyms. But I don't even think it's really a strike against traditional authorship. Luke was plausibly a Gentile, so Greek may well have been his first language. We don't really know that much about Mark, but there's no real reason to suppose that he couldn't speak Greek or couldn't have learned how to speak Greek. Matthew, being a tax collector, almost certainly would have had to know some Greek, and there's no real reason to suppose that John couldn't have learned Greek for the sake of furthering the gospel. And additionally, our gospels could have been composed with the help of Greek-speaking scribes. So the fact that our gospels are in Greek it's not a problem for the traditional authorship hypothesis. On a related note, Kevin seems to think that it's unlikely that any of Jesus' disciples could have written, given the widespread illiteracy during that time. But again, Matthew and Luke would have had to be literate. Mark and John could have been aided by scribes or simply learned to read and write in Greek at a later point in time. Kevin also believes that the Gospels are quite late, plausibly later than the lives of many of those who were supposed to have written them. Now, this is slightly off topic. I'm more than happy to defend the early dates of the Gospels. I believe that Paul betrays dependence upon Matthew and Luke in places in his writings. And indeed, there's some reason to think that when Paul uses this phrase, according to my gospel, in his epistles, he's actually referencing the Gospel of Luke. This would place Matthew and Luke well into the 40s AD. Mark seems to have been a second-generation believer, so the standard date for his gospel of around 70 AD, that's not going to be problematic for Mark being the author, though I think it actually dates at some point in the early 60s. And there's also, I want to mention, there's a kind of a catch-22 here for the skeptic, because the earlier they would want to, the later that they want to date the Gospels, the closer they're putting them to the patristic witness. So the smaller you make the gap between the people who are telling us that these Gospels were written by the eyewitnesses and their followers. And the earlier you date them, the closer you push them to Jesus. So there's I think there's a catch-22 there for no matter which way the skeptic wants to go on dating. I think the canonical Gospel of John is probably a second edition published after the death of the apostle with some editorial clarifications. And my reason for that is found in John 21:23. It looks like the editor of the Gospel is trying to correct a rumor that John the apostle would sort of live until Jesus returned. But the upshot there is that the author of that Gospel was known. So to sum all that up, I think that Kevin's primary argument is an argument from silence. His star witness, Justin Martyr, actually does betray knowledge of who wrote the Gospels. The other issue he raised are not really relevant to the issue of anonymity, but I think that those issues can be answered anyway. So overall, I just don't think it's a serious challenge to the traditional authorship hypothesis.
All right, excellent. Okay, so thank you for that, Dave. All right, so next we are going to move into a 20-minute cross-examination. So I'm sure that most of the audience is already familiar with this, but I just wanted to go ahead and remind, during the cross-examination period, it is acceptable for the person whose turn it is to interrupt the person that they're asking the questions to. So it might appear as rude. It's not actually rude. That's just, due to the time constraint, it's acceptable to interrupt in this. Debates are not casual conversations. These are clashes of ideas, clashes of egos, not clashes of egos. So But anyway, so we will move into the 20-minute cross-examination. And Kevin, I will start this off as soon as you start talking.
Okay, thank you so much for the rebuttal, Dave. I've got a whole bunch of questions for you. I'm going to start off with a very advanced technique that's called the reverse ad hominem. So get ready, okay? So you study at Trinity College of the Bible, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. I read the statement of faith from Trinity, and I saw nothing that would commit you to traditional authorship. I only saw a commitment to scripture being inspired and authoritative, which to me means that you hold to the traditional authorship for no other purpose than for facts and for reason. Is that correct?
I would like to think so.
Unbelievable. Okay. The questions will get harder, but I just wanted to make sure that I kind of address that first, because like the big like atheist talking point is always like, oh, like, you know, you study at a conservative Christian school, that must mean that you're committed to traditional authorship. But this question, the real point was because I wanted to point out that you are not committed to this from some kind of like religious like presupposition. You are committed to this idea because you think that that's where the facts lead, and I think that's like a really important place to start. Okay. A couple more like easier questions before I want to get into some harder ones. So, do you think it's possible that tradition got some of the authors correct, and it's possible that tradition got some of the authors wrong, like 50-50 or 75-25?
Well, I mean, if we're using possible in like the broadest sense of that's logically possible, well, yeah, there's not a contradiction entailed by the negation of that.
Yep, that's all I was going for. If you had to pick one of the 4 canonical gospels as being like the one that like the trad authorship is the most solid for you, which one would it be and why?
Oh, Gospel of John, because you've got the explicit identification of the author within the gospel itself.
I'm going to have questions for you about that later, but I'm going to come back to that. The reverse side of that question is, if you had to pick one of the canonical gospels that you think is the least likely that the trad authorship got the authorship correct, which one would it be and why?
It's going to be either Matthew or Luke, and it's probably going to be Matthew because you've got a lot of attributions to the Gospel of Matthew, but a lot of them also state that it was written in Hebrew. On the issue of Papias and Irenaeus, I think that it's possible for the word there dialecto to mean that this is a Hebrew style or a Hebrew dialect. But you don't have that kind of wiggle room when it comes to people like Origen and Augustine. These people very clearly believe it's written in the Hebrew language, and that's even possibly what these other later writers are thinking. I don't think that makes them evidentially worthless, even if that's what they're saying. I still think that you have to give some kind of account of why it is that our Greek Gospel of Matthew got attributed to Matthew. But I think that because of that, because you've got that kind of gap there, it's going to make the case weaker for Matthew than for any of the others.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Okay, I've got a couple like epistemological type questions for you, like still related to scholarship and all that. So I often hear, and I heard a little bit during your rebuttal, that like the case for anonymity is an argument from silence. So I've got this is like a leading question. It's a gotcha. So, buckle up. No, it's not going to be that bad. But if I told you that I had cheese in my refrigerator and you opened up the refrigerator and you couldn't find any cheese in the refrigerator, like the refrigerator was just bare, it was empty. And you said to me, Kevin, there's no cheese in this refrigerator. And I'm like, where's your evidence? And you're like, there's an empty refrigerator. And I was like, that's an argument from silence. Like, you'd probably be like, come on, Kevin. Right? So let me just turn that into a question by saying, would you say that my characterization right there is like an accurate, like there are situations where an argument from silence makes sense?
So I think that there's a difference between arguments that are based on things that we don't have, information that we don't have, and arguments that are based on information which we do have. So in the case of the refrigerator, I've got epistemic access to what's in your refrigerator, right? I have actually evidence that this is not there, right? It would be another thing, to be, I don't know, off the top of my head, I'm having difficulty relating it to that particular example. But suffice to say, there's a difference between arguments based on information that we do have, as is the case the refrigerator, versus what I saw your argument, the argument that I was selling, an argument from silence, is based on information which we don't have.
Yeah. So I view the empty refrigerator as being all of these apostolic father attributions that we have that don't list the anonymity. I imagine that you don't see it that way. And I'm curious to see how you don't see it that way. In other words, like, what do you make of the fact that we have nearly 100 years worth of apostolic fathers not quoting the Gospels by the names that we know them as today? Like, that seems pretty weird.
Yeah, well, as I indicated, I mean, obviously the case of Papias, I think we do have the names, and in the case of Justin Martyr, I think we have strong indications that the names are at least known. As to
I'm going to
why
press
it
you on
is,
that.
okay,
Sorry, I
as to
didn't
why,
mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
yeah, you're good, you're good. This is your time.
That's
As it currently stands, with the other names that you brought up, Clement and such, I mean, we're dealing with a fairly short, letters here addressed to other Christians. Like, I'm just thinking, I mean, maybe this is bad because I'm using kind of my own modern perspective here. But like when I'm in, like, just at church talking to fellow Christians and stuff, I'll just say, like, Jesus said, love your neighbor, right? And I'm not like gonna say like Matthew said this. I'm not gonna say Luke said this, right? I say Jesus said that. I don't feel the need to, like, in that context of other believers, reference the particular gospel that I'm citing. And I mean, we know that there was liturgical use and such for the gospels, that they were viewed as scripture very early on. It doesn't seem inconceivable to me that they would have had a similar sort of perspective on things. Even today, when I read, like, not sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
So I was just going to say that I actually agree with you that I wouldn't think that it's super weird if we had like a whole bunch of interspersed people who were treating them anonymously and not anonymously. Like you pointed out with Irenaeus, I don't think that the Gospels were anonymous anymore by like 180, because even though Irenaeus treats them as anonymous every now and then, he doesn't treat them as anonymous. He very clearly has their traditional names in mind. But like, there's this like really clear dividing line by my lights at like 170-ish. And again, I'm not married to that date. I'll move that date. But like, so it's almost like it seems like the person who holds trad authorship has to hold to this like super weird coincidence view. We're like, yeah, it's just like a super funny coincidence that nobody called them by their traditional names for like 100 years. You know what I mean?
Papias did.
Okay. And we'll get into Papias more in a little bit. That's going to lead me into my next. I have like maybe 10 minutes worth of questions that are like prepared. And then I kind of want to go into like a little bit more free flow. For this next section, I'm really only looking for yes or no answers, but I do promise to, or I don't know, or yes, no, I don't know. And then after I hit you with like these like 15 questions or something like that, I'm going to say, okay, now give it to me. So, cause you're going to have thoughts and you're going to hate the fact that this is only a yes or no. So here we go. Do you think that Judas wrote the Gospel of Judas?
No.
No? Even though we don't have a single anonymous manuscript of the Gospel of Judas?
Yeah, no.
And that's still just a yes or no. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Do you think that Thomas wrote the Gospel of Thomas?
No.
Even though we don't have a single anonymous manuscript of the Gospel of Thomas?
Yeah, no.
Okay. Do you think that Peter wrote the Gospel of Peter?
No.
Even though we don't have a single anonymous manuscript of the Gospel of Peter?
No.
Do you think that Bartholomew wrote the Gospel of Bartholomew?
No.
Even though we don't have a single anonymous manuscript of the Gospel of Bartholomew?
No.
Even though there seems to be no reason to name a gospel after such a minor character?
No.
One more set of questions. Do you think that Nicodemus wrote the Gospel of Nicodemus?
I do not.
Even though we don't have a single anonymous manuscript?
No.
Even though there seems to be no reason to name a gospel after such a minor character like Nicodemus?
Nope.
Even though Justin Martyr refers to this one as something that the Christians of the early mid-2nd century thought of as sacred scripture?
That's more interesting, but no.
Okay. Those are my questions. I was so mean to you by limiting only to yes and no, and I don't know. So, obviously, this was like a rhetorical point, but I'm passing the microphone to you for like a minute or so if you kind of want to respond to these very leading questions that I just asked.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it's a fair question to ask, right? If we've got other types of documents that don't have sort of anonymous copies and that are always attributed to these people, and that's not evidence for them being authored by these particular individuals. Why is it in the case of the Gospels? And I think, and I'm not going to be fully familiar with sort of all of these apocryphal Gospels, but from what I understand, most of them, if not all of them, because I know some like Thomas are more controversial, but from what I understand, my very limited understanding, there's other relevant information here, such as that these date to significantly later than the time of these individuals, which is not going to be the case with the four Gospels. At least I would be prepared to argue it's not the case with our four canonical Gospels. So there's a relevant difference there in terms of when the document is written, such that the person it's being attributed to is not even capable of being the author. Another point I would want to raise is that I don't think that these Gospels are anonymous, right? I think that they're written under pseudonyms. So I don't think that this provides a case for anonymity, because even if the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are sort of incorrect, that still doesn't by itself mean that these are anonymous, because a document can be written as a pseudonym. So those are some of my thoughts on sort of that series of questions.
Yeah, no, I like it. And just, cards on the table too. I would, like, if you asked me like which one, like Kevin, either the Gospel of Thomas was really written by Thomas, or Mark was really written by Mark, and you have to pick which one. Mark, like, it's easy. Like, it's not even, so, I'm asking you all these questions, even though, I want to make it clear that I'm not like, I don't think of myself like a fundamentalist when it comes to this stuff. You know what I mean? I like to think of myself as somebody who like, no, the evidence for Mark is a lot better than the evidence for Thomas. But anyway, okay. I have a question for you about something that you kind of addressed a little bit in your rebuttal, I think. So you talked a little bit about like a second edition of John, which I think is really interesting. I had a prepared question that I'm just going to read for you, but you're going to see where this question where it ties in. So my question was this. Do you agree that the Gospels that we have today include additions that we know were not in the earliest manuscripts? In particular, I'm thinking about like from John, the Pericope Adulterae, from like Mark, we have like the false ending, things like that. Like, so would you agree that we have passages that weren't in the earliest manuscripts?
Yeah, I would agree that there's kind of artifacts within our Gospels that were not there when originally written.
Okay. Do you think that those pericopes are anonymous? Like, do you think that we know who wrote those?
I think in the case of the Gospel of John, when we're talking about these sorts of like we know that his testimony is true and things like that. So when we kind of get like these editorial asides in the Gospel of John, I think that there's a decent case for thinking that this is actually Papias who's written those. I'm not going to be dogmatic on that, but if we're using the definition of anonymity that I have sort of stipulated for this definition, then those sections,
which I'm good with.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say it's anonymous in the sense that it's it might be known or might have been known that it was Papias, because I think he's our best candidate for that. But putting that aside, like the long ending of Mark or John chapter 8, or these kind of disputed passages that were interpolated or whatever, sure, I'm happy with saying that those are anonymous.
I see the rest of my time. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But cool. Hey, progress, okay. So I've got a couple kind of like open-ended questions for you next. And I'm almost just wondering like the best way to phrase this. Take your time on this one. How much does Matthean priority play into your view of trad authorship? Like, and what I mean by this is like, if you became convinced, like right now, like divine revelation, that Markan priority is true all of a sudden, does that move you closer or further away from the trad authorship view towards the anonymity view, or does it not move you at all? Like what's the interplay there? And I know this isn't a debate about Matthean priority. I'm just curious.
Yeah. No, but I mean, they are the issues are linked together, especially in as much as a lot of our early sources to authorship are also concerned with gospel order. So I think that the debates are related. If like we knew for sure that Markan priority was true, I think that would have to be some degree of evidence against traditional authorship. I don't think it would be sufficient. I would probably adopt like the kind of perspective that somebody like Theodore Zahn or Martin Moss takes, according to which our canonical Gospel of Matthew sort of is like an expanded edition of a Hebrew original that kind of incorporated Mark into it. There's still kind of the nagging question there of the why does Matthew, an eyewitness, making use of a secondhand account? The best way to go there for me is to say because he knows that this is Peter. So it's not inconceivable to me. You just have to add a lot more to the story, which increases the complexity of your hypothesis. And the more complex your hypothesis is, the more ways it can go wrong. So it's more intrinsically likely to be false. So it would have to lower the probability of the traditional authorship of at least the Gospel of Matthew, if Markan priority is true. But I think given my total evidence right now, no, it wouldn't be significant enough for me to say, no, I don't think that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew.
So I'm glad that you said that. And I think that I didn't phrase my question quite right too, because by no means did I think that like somebody who's convinced of trad authorship should like change their mind like that just based on the order in which they were written. So I'm glad that you like made that, like you took my question and you gave it the clarity that I meant to give it and didn't. So thank you for that. And you also actually kind of touched on my next question too. So you talked about Hebrew Matthew. So same question here, but Hebrew Matthew. So how much does Hebrew Matthew play into your view of trad authorship?
It doesn't, because I don't think that there was a Hebrew Matthew. I'm open to that possibility.
Okay.
Yeah, because I will interpret, I think Papias and Irenaeus are best interpreted as saying that Matthew wrote his gospel in a Hebrew dialect, Hebrew style. And then I think that this was later confused with the Gospel of the Hebrews by people like Origen and Augustine and Eusebius and Jerome. And so I think a confusion took place because these people, they didn't speak Hebrew, they spoke Greek. So I think that, I'm very much with somebody like Bernard Orchard or Robert Gundry. That's my guess at what happened, is that this idea that there was a Hebrew Matthew was born out of this sort of later confusion. But I'm open to the possibility that I could be wrong.
I have like this big appendix in my slides with like a whole bunch of like just stuff that I wasn't sure if it was going to come up. And I found like a survey of like Greek experts, and they were honing in on that word dialecto in that like Hebrew, like Hebraised dialecto. That's the Greek for Hebrew dialect. And they were saying that dialecto never meant something like it never meant something like a Greek version of that language. It always meant that language, because apparently that word actually means tongue or language. So like the way that he said it was like the Hebrew tongue or the Hebrew language. I'll share the survey that I found with you at some point in the future. And I'm going to start speculating wildly with you for a second. So just, bear with me. I'm actually kind of partial to this idea of a Hebrew Matthew that has been completely lost to history. Shem Tov Matthew is not what I'm talking about here. Shem Tov Matthew is from like 1,000 years later or whatever. But I'm kind of partial to this idea of like some kind of proto Matthew, like having pre-existed Greek Matthew that has just been lost to history. Do you think I'm onto something here? Like, do you think that's possible?
I mean, like I said, for me, I would be there with you if I don't know if I would say it's been completely lost, but I might be there with you if I were to come to think that Papias and Irenaeus are actually best interpreted as saying Hebrew language. And there is a case for that because as you mentioned, that is actually the normal usage of dialecto. I'm not an expert in Greek. I'll say I can cite scholars who will say that yes, this word can also mean style or dialect, something like that. So you would have your scholars, I would have mine at that point.
Yeah,
say yes, it can mean this, and ones who say no, it can't.
Yeah, and let me just hold up my I am not a Greek expert card, and so like I would need to kind of just like punt on that one. You know what I mean? I have to be like, okay. Like some scholars say one thing, some scholars say another. Oh well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say one thing that's fascinating to me is that I was recently reading Michael Koch's book. Sorry, it's your time. So
yeah, and I have like 45 seconds left, and I had one more thing that I wanted to get to, if that's okay. So I just wanted to ask you about like the trustworthiness of Papias. So I'm not on the like Papias is completely untrustworthy and don't trust a single word that he says. The way that Eusebius seems to be, like Eusebius said something like Papias is a man of like limited intelligence or something like that. Like Eusebius hated the guy, but I do think that Papias says some weird stuff. Like the story about Judas is like super weird. And then also the story, he like quotes Jesus as talking about like vines growing, and each vine will have 1,000 branches, and each branch will have 1,000 twigs, and each twig will have 1,000 grapes on it. I'm out of time. Maybe we could talk about this later. I just think it's weird, and I don't know.
We'll have to petition Kyle and ask if I'm allowed to give my thoughts on that.
I'll tell you what, yeah, if you want to go ahead and just give your thoughts on that real quick, I will. I won't start the timer. Just a note to the audience: please send in your questions. We're gonna have 30 minutes. We have 30 minutes allotted for the questions, but like obviously, if there's no questions, we'll cut it short. So have your questions come in, and we'll have those. But yeah, Dave, why don't you go ahead and finish your thoughts on Kevin's questions, and then I will start your timer when you tell me to.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief on this as I possibly can because I have so many thoughts on this.
And it's a big question. I know. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. On the Judas question, okay, for people who aren't initiated, basically we have this record in Apollinarius of Laodicea. He allegedly records that Papias told us this absurd story about Judas, who was like big and bloated, and his head couldn't even fit through doors, and like he would like pee worms and things when he tried to pee, and he eventually, ended up dying and created this stench that lasted for a century. Very interesting stuff. First thing to note, Apollinaris quotes the passage twice. He does not quote it the same way. One is significantly less exaggerated than the other. We do not know which one goes back to Papias, if indeed either of them do. So it's really dubious to make this an objection to Papias because we don't know how much of it is original to him. Second point on this is that there's this sort of ancient form of rhetorical exaggeration called ekphrasis. And we know from sort of rhetorical textbooks at the time that you're supposed to start at the person's head and sort of work your way down the body and sort of describe the things that came before, during, and after. It looks like this is exactly what Papias could be doing. So he could be engaging in rhetorical ekphrasis, which would have been recognized as such to his original audience. And another point is we have the context of this quotation. We don't know what Papias is trying to do there, right? We don't know that he's saying, hey, this is something that really happened. He could be engaging in a harmonization with Judas's death in the New Testament. We just don't know. As far as the story of the grapes go, I'm of the controversial opinion. I think that could actually be an authentic saying of Jesus. And my reason for that is because we don't just have that recorded in Papias. Irenaeus lists a lot of people who actually seem to say this. And there's not, as long as we recognize that it's metaphorical, there's not anything like theologically objectionable in that quotation from Jesus. So I'm of the opinion that could be an authentic saying of Jesus, even though it's not recorded in the Gospels. Final thought is that regardless of whether or not Papias is reliable or not here, the source of his information on the Gospels, it's from John the Elder. We don't have any reason to think that Papias isn't reliably transmitting information, even if some of the information that he's giving to us can't be trusted. So sorry, those are my thoughts on the basic reliability objections.
All right, cool. And with that, I'm going to start your cross-examination now.
Okay. So Kevin, first up, why Mark and Luke? All right, this is something I've always kind of really wanted to get a skeptical perspective on. Why, if you're going to attribute Gospels to people, and it's not because these people really wrote them, why on earth would you pick Mark and Luke?
So I have theories, and I don't know which one I kind of lean more towards, but I'll sketch a few as briefly as I can. The first I'm going to call like the more generous theory to the trad authorship view, and that's that there was some kind of tradition from Mark and from Luke where like the actual historical Mark and Luke legitimately were like spreading these details around, and that there were communities that kind of wrote down what they thought, like how they thought Mark would have said it, and they wrote down how they thought Luke would have said it. And so that strikes me as a totally plausible view where you have these communities who are attributing the Gospels to Mark and Luke, but these Gospels are very much so not written by Mark and Luke. So that's the first view that I think about as like more generous. And the second view is there does appear to be some kind of like I don't know what to call it, like some kind of practice of naming things after kind of minor characters, like we see with the Gospel of Nicodemus and the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Bartholomew, the Gospel of Philip. Like there's a whole bunch of things like that. One interesting theory that I've heard about Mark in particular is that the Gospel of Peter was actually already in circulation by the time that they were going to go name the Gospel of Mark. So like, dang it, we can't take Peter. I guess we'll take Mark. Something that I've heard. Long story short, I don't know, but those are all kind of like different ideas that sound plausible to me.
Do you think it gives any weight to it, the fact that these are sort of insignificant figures that, have been attributed to these gospels? Do you think that's any kind of evidential weight on the side of genuineness there?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I'm not one of those people who's like, there's no evidence for anything, really. There's like, the way that like epistemologists talk about evidence is such that like there's pretty much evidence for almost anything. The question is there enough evidence? I think that the names of the gospels that we have are indeed evidence. And I think that like if they were all called like the gospel that Jesus Christ wrote down, I'd be like, that's a little weird. So yes, I do think that the gospel names are like a chip, maybe a small chip, but a chip on the side of trad authorship.
Fair. Okay. All right. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's well, maybe we'll save Papias for a minute here. Let's deal with a little more internal evidence. What about John 21:24? I want to hear someone who thinks that this gospel is anonymous. We have like an explicit statement in John 21:24 that the disciple Jesus loved wrote this gospel. What do you do with that?
Yeah, so I have it in my appendix somewhere. So in John 21:24, it reads, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true." That is John 21:24. I like to kind of point out John 19:34, in which I'll read out the whole text, but I just want to point out that the beloved disciple is being contrasted here with the author. So it says, "He who saw this and has testified so that you may believe his testimony is true, and he knows that he tells you the truth." So this is the beloved disciple, the guy who's writing it. But then earlier, he's talking about that guy who wrote it. So it's a little unclear to me. And this kind of like this bolsters my view in the like the community view particularly for John, but I think that all of these gospels had communities. So yeah, that's kind of my stance there. It's like I don't think that John 21:24 is like sufficient for me to say that like that's got to be whoever wrote it was the beloved disciple.
Yeah, so I mean, in my opinion, there are scholars like Richard Bauckham who will argue that was written by the disciple or the beloved disciple. I mean, there's interesting arguments on that side, but I'm inclined to agree with you. I don't think that the beloved disciple himself wrote those verses. I think that these are being added in by a later editor. Mm-hmm. But they do attribute the gospel, nevertheless, to the beloved disciple. I mean, do you think that that's just it's just false? They don't know what they're talking about?
No. So I suspect that there was a community that kind of sprung up around the beloved disciple, and that this community wrote and kept writing a gospel according to him. We haven't gotten into the word kata at all yet. But I think that the word kata is like further evidence for like this kind of community view.
Okay, so I guess I'm struggling to see why doesn't that challenge anonymity then? If the community thinks that this is Johannine, then wouldn't that mean that it's attributed to him, even if it's being done incorrectly, right? Even if John is not the author, doesn't that suggest that this has always been attributed to John?
So no, I don't think that's quite right. I think that's what's happening with John is that we have a evolving gospel for like 100 years. Not 100, but like 90 or 80 years. And that this gospel is being added to over time. And I think that we have some sections of the gospel, like 21:24, that's written by somebody completely different as 1935. So I think that 2124 points to one disciple and 1935 points to a different disciple. Neither of them actually say who they are. So I think it's like kind of just unclear to me. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if that
So
answered your question.
I mean, it seems so. Suffice to say, you don't think that because they say it's so. Would help me out here though. Would you say it's at least been attributed to the beloved disciple for as long as John 21:24 was there?
No, so I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because we don't have any evidence of anybody referring to this gospel as the Gospel of John until Irenaeus.
I think we do in Papias, but maybe we'll
We
get
might
to
need to
that
talk
in a
about
minute.
Papias. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But real quick, let's hit Theophilus and Luke, right? First of all, let me ask: do you think that Theophilus? Do you take the position that that is a person?
Yeah. I'm fine with
Okay.
Theophilus being a person.
Okay.
Do you want me to tell you
There's
who
some
I
people who
think?
think.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead. Well, who do you think Theophilus is?
I think Theophilus was a patron. So the way that like authorship worked in the ancient, and I know that you know this kind of more for the audience. Writing was like a really expensive endeavor. You didn't own books unless you were rich. And how did you acquire books? You paid people to copy them for you. Mostly you paid like monastic types who like lived in a monastery and they had a whole library, and like you could buy one of their books from the library, but you're not going to buy that book. You're paying the monk to copy the book for you. That was how it was before the printing press, frankly. And so I think that Theophilus was a patron who was paying the author of that particular manuscript to write the Gospel of Luke for him. And Theophilus was probably like a super early Christian. Like, in fact, the person who wrote Luke might have been copying from Mark or from Matthew, if you know you're of that persuasion. And he changed a few things. Maybe not for Theophilus. He changed them for himself or whatever, but he was writing it to Theophilus. That's kind of my crackpot theory.
Okay. And so then Theophilus, if he is a person, right? We're not taking the position that that's sort of like some sort of personification of Christians abroad. Then is it really conceivable to you that Theophilus doesn't know who's writing to him when he says it seemed good to me to write? Theophilus doesn't know who that is?
No, I think that Theophilus knew. I just don't think
Wouldn't
that
that make
anybody
it-
else knows.
So, all right, but this would seem at least to challenge anonymity, at least from a point, right? Because we have defined it as the thesis that the Gospels are unknown either to us or to the original recipient. So this does seem to, at least in a certain sense, mean that Luke is not anonymous because the author is known, at least to the immediate recipient of the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah, this might be a semantic point. But
Yeah.
here's like what I believe. So I believe that the Gospel of Luke was written for Theophilus. It was sent to Theophilus. Theophilus was like, "Hey, random monastic dude, thanks for copying the Gospel of Luke for me." Well, the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Mark, maybe. And Theophilus died, and 100 years later, we started calling it the Gospel of Luke. So, is that anonymous?
So
depends on your definition.
Yeah. Depends on how strict you want to be with that. I won't press that point because okay. But you do think then that at any rate Theophilus knows who's writing to him. You just don't think anyone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious though. How do you think it got into? And sorry, this is a little off topic. But how do you think it got into circular? Because we have Gospel of Luke being quoted very early, right? We've got like Ignatius quoting it. I would argue we have Papias quoting it. So the Gospel of Luke, especially if assuming you're taking something like what, like an 85 date, probably a late date for Luke.
Yeah, I'm not married to that date, but yeah, like 85-ish.
So it gets into use very early and gets recognized as an authoritative gospel. And if like it's just some random guy that like Theophilus has doing this for him that doesn't have any clout, it seems weird that this gospel that was like apparently written personally for Theophilus should have gotten use in like the Christian community, particularly the authoritative Christian community, that early on, kind of on what you called your crackpot hypothesis. That just seems weird to me.
Yeah, so I actually wouldn't hold that the Gospel of Luke, like per se, is being quoted. Um, like when like Ignatius, for instance, or Clement of Rome are quoting from the Gospels. Like my whole opening was like they're not saying like the Gospel of Luke said this. They're just saying the words of the Lord, and then they're quoting from like the synoptics. So it's clear to me that the same material in Luke is the material that's being quoted by Clement, but Clement wouldn't have called it the Gospel of Luke. So I think it's entirely possible that like Clement of Rome owned a copy of the Gospel of Luke that just like didn't have the Dear Theophilus like included in it. Um, and Justin Martyr has clearly Justin Martyr has some amalgamation of the Gospels all kind of smushed together. We can tell by the way that he quotes them, right? The Memoirs of the Apostles is like this one unitary work as far as Justin Martyr is concerned. So I don't think that like the Gospels were. Yeah, but the way that he quotes them makes it seem like he never delineates them. He never delineates the memoirs.
I think he does when he talks about the memoirs according to Peter, but I'll let that rest. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's your section. So if you want to grill me on that part, I love that part. But
well, I just wanted to make sure that we did have time to get to Papias, but go ahead and finish.
So I just think that the Gospels were kind of not super well delineated until like Irenaeus, after the traditional names had stuck, and we didn't need the traditional names prior to that because nobody owned all four of the Gospels anyway, because they were still kind of like circulating and spreading around. Like you were lucky if you had one Gospel.
Okay, that's interesting, but yeah, let me move on to Papias here. So all right, so you mentioned the objection that he talks about logia, right? And that so that you interpret that as sayings, right? So he's probably not talking about our Gospels of Matthew and Mark because he distinguishes them as logia. So I mean, in the quotations that we have from Eusebius, right? He says that Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order whatsoever he remembered, of the things said or done by Christ, and then he goes on in that same passage to refer to that as the Lord's logia. Irenaeus and Origen both use logia as a synonym for gospel in their writings. I mean, it seems very clear that logia can be used much more broadly than just sayings, and indeed, in Papias, we have reason to think that he's using this to mean both words and deeds. What do you think of
that? So yeah, I mean, I guess. Okay, so first, it's probably important for me to pull out the ignorance card and say I'm certainly not familiar with every single use of the word logia. But then I guess secondly, I would just point out the way that Papias writes about how Mark is not in order and it's a logia, to me is like, okay, that's the Gospel of Thomas. Because like a logia gospel. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. I would say, but don't you think that could be talking about? I mean, chronological order here, right? I mean, he's being contrasted with the order in Matthew, right? So there seems to be some recognition, because if we just take our canonical Gospels of Matthew and Mark, the events don't all happen in the same order here, right? So, I mean, it's in fact, if you restrict it to sayings, it's not even really clear to me why this would be an objection. Whatever concern Papias's elder has here, it has something to do with that there's a difference in order, at least between Matthew and Mark. And if we accept the new fragment, then it's going to be in Luke and John as well. But I mean, just between Matthew and Mark, there's this concern of the different orders there, which we have in our canonical Gospels of Matthew and Mark, right? But it's chronological. So I don't see why we wouldn't just basically transpose that into what we already know, as opposed to positing, increasing the complexity of our hypothesis by positing these sort of proto-Gospels.
So sorry, this is going to be like a roundabout answer. I really like what you just said about like not increasing complexity with proto-gospels. I'm a big like Occam's razor guy myself. So yep, valid point. I like that. But with regard to like the whole order thing, I think that like it would be super weird to describe our Mark as being a logia in no particular order. Like that just strikes me as like,
I'm not sure if he says no particular order, though. Doesn't he just say not in order?
Let me pull it up because I had it in my opening statement. Let me find it.
Sure. I mean, I know there are different translations of ecclesiastical history, so maybe some do render it that way. I don't think I've seen one that says no particular order.
Yeah, it's very possible that I was just like embellishing. Okay, so Papias says, Mark, having become the interpreter and translator of Peter, wrote down accurately, however, not in order, all that he had recalled of what was either said or done by the Lord. And then so none of that included the word logia, but where logia does come in is when he says, but later he followed Peter, who used to adapt his instructions to the needs of the audience, but not with a view of making an orderly account of the Lord's sayings. So, and that's sayings being logia. So, the disorderly construction of the sayings, the not in order, and just the word logia in general, just really to me don't sound like our Mark.
Okay, well, I mean, I did try to respond to that part earlier about where Papias also uses it to mean words and deeds, as do Irenaeus and Origen. So, to me, it just seems like it's unnecessary. The evidence that we have in Papias fits with our Gospels of Matthew and Mark. We know that they have different orders. So I guess I don't see the need to posit these proto-sayings Gospels. I don't want to add that into my hypothesis. I prefer the simpler one, and if I can make this work without like really straining, it seems to fit with our Matthew and Mark. That's
I'm
just
partial to that.
On it.
No, really, I am partial to that. I like not multiplying entities beyond necessity.
Okay, so I'm just curious though. So he attributes this right to John the Elder, right? So if this is our Matthew and Mark, then this is getting pushed back even beyond Papias. Do you think that this would at least suggest that Matthew and Mark, or at least this would be evidence that Matthew and Mark were not anonymous?
Oh, for sure. I think that Papias is a chip on the scale for the trad authorship of Matthew and Mark. And I'll even go further and say that like Papias probably also wrote about John and Luke, and we've just lost that to history, probably because Eusebius didn't like whatever he had to say about John and Luke. Because if you look at where Eusebius is quoting Papias as talking about Mark and Matthew, he talks about them in order. So like he probably brought up Luke and John in the same sentence, and Eusebius just like didn't like it, and so like didn't write it down or something. That's so I do think that.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, it's your turn. No, it's your time.
Well, I was just saying, so you're not partial to Hill's case that Eusebius actually does preserve it in Ecclesiastical History 324.
Remind me what book 3 chapter 24 is all about.
In 324, Eusebius mentions a record which talks about the origins of the Gospels, but he doesn't name it. But Hill compares that to what he does tell us about Matthew in Mark in Ecclesiastical History 339. There's common concerns about order. There's a lot of similar words in there. So his hypothesis is that actually what's going on there is that this is Papias's account, and that Eusebius just chose to refer to it as the record because.
Oh,
yeah,
interesting. I'm not familiar with that. That's interesting. I'm gonna have to look into that more. That's cool.
Yeah, I can.
Eusebius
send you
did
Hill's
hate Papias.
He did. So that's what I. Oh, all right. We're out of time.
All right, you two. That was enough of that. That was man. Like that. You know, I come in here and it's just like it's okay to interrupt, and that was the most polite and gentle like cross examination I've ever seen in my life. So well done.
I grilled Dave. Are you serious? Look at him.
That was probably. That was awesome. Okay.
I saw somebody in the chat told me to call Kevin a poopy head because there wasn't enough blood.
I saw that.
Okay, so I didn't have to do it. So okay, there we go. All right. Well, yeah, and for the record, that was the other Paul. Okay, so now on to Q&A. Right now, I've identified 7 different questions. So I think just for whatever, what we'll do is we'll say, I'll ask the question. You know, if it's directed to Kevin, you'll get a 2 minutes to respond to answer the question, and then Dave, if you want to offer like a 1 minute response to whatever Kevin said, that's fine. Yeah. So on that note, so Zachary asks a question for Kevin. Why would Mark and Luke each be credited with writing a gospel? Wouldn't more prominent individuals be credited if the attributions were false?
So, yeah. So, I mean, Dave and I kind of discussed this already. I do consider those chips on the scale in favor of trad authorship, just not huge chips on the scale. And the reason why is because we have other gospels that are named after likewise not very important characters like Nicodemus, Bartholomew, Philip. Nobody thinks that those are actually written by Nicodemus and Bartholomew. So, like, it's a chip on the scale. I just don't think it's like a particularly huge chip on the scale, if that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Is that all you have?
I think so, because we kind of this question may have come in before we kind of touched on this during the cross-examination.
Yeah, this question was asked about 30 minutes ago. So, but anyway, Dave, do you want to go ahead and add your 2 cents in?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just say in the case of, like, for example, bring up like Bartholomew and Philip and people, well, it's true that these aren't particularly prominent people in the Gospels. They are at least apostles, right? And so when you started getting, Gospels attributed to people like Peter and things, eventually you started running out of names. So you would have to start going after the smaller apostles. I think that can explain why you have these ones. Nicodemus is a little more curious, but of course, Nicodemus also in the Gospel of John does get to talk to Jesus specifically, so there could be some motivation for a gospel there. It doesn't seem to me that we have like anything like that in the case of Mark or Luke. Like, I don't see anything like that at all. So I do think that there's a bit of an evidential asymmetry there, such that these other examples Kevin is bringing up, in addition to the fact that these gospels are so much later that they couldn't have been written by these people anyway. I don't think the evidence is really quite there, but I do think that what Kevin is saying, it's worth considering.
Okay. All right. Excellent.
I think that Thomas is early enough that theoretically it could be written by Thomas. I don't think it was, but Thomas is pretty early. But Thomas is also like a really main. Sorry?
I would say it is controversial. I got arguments for it being late, but.
Oh, interesting. For another time.
Okay. So next question. So we have the other Paul is asking for both of you, and so Kevin, you answered first. So Dave, I'm going to hear your response first. Have either of you read Monty A. Shanks's scholarly work, Papias and the New Testament, and/or Stephen Carlson's edition commentary on Papias? These are essential works.
Yeah, I have Monty Shank's book. I have read it, and I have an upcoming video on the authorship of the Gospels where, when I'm answering objections to Papias, I'll be quoting from Shank's book extensively. I really want Carlson's book, but unfortunately, it's like $200 on Amazon right now, and that's a little outside of my budget at the moment. I have one of my friends, Bram Rawlings, he does have the book, and he sent me, pictures of it and things. So I've read portions of Carlson's book, but I don't own that one, and I haven't read it through.
Okay, Kevin?
I'll make my answer quick. I have read and I have owned neither of those, but if anybody has PDFs that they want to email me, my email is on my about page on my channel if you want to send them to me.
Okay, excellent. Also, I imagine both of the debaters would be not opposed to you mailing them these books if you feel ever so inclined to do so. All right. So I don't know who this is directed to, so Kevin, I'm going to let you go first. Don't some of your church fathers from the anonymity era also fail to cite the Old Testament text by name? I think Ignatius especially does this.
So some yes, some no. I don't recall Ignatius offhand, but an example of somebody who does cite the Old Testament without citing the traditionally held authors is Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr is like super thorough when he like cites stuff. Like, he even cites the pagans like Pythagoras, and he cites the Old Testament like frequently. But when he cites from the memoirs of the apostles, he never refers to them as Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So I think that the answer there is probably going to be some yes, some no. So Ignatius's letters were all written while he was like marching to Rome to be executed, right? So he doesn't cite the New Testament the gospel authors by name, like I said in my intro, but Dave brought up a really good point where like he's probably kind of writing like a little quick because he's on his way to go be executed. So he's like writing as many letters as he can or whatever, like on his final march to Rome or whatever. Is that where he got killed? Rome? Doesn't matter. But so when Ignatius cites when he quotes the Gospels, sometimes he just writes it as if he came up with it. Now, obviously, he would have known that like the person receiving the letters would have recognized that as something that Jesus said, because like, you know, he's very obviously quoting Jesus, even though he doesn't say Jesus said this. So is it possible that Ignatius does that with the Old Testament? Yeah, probably. I can't think of one offhand. So I know that there are cases where the answer to that is there are cases where the Apostolic Fathers do quote the Old Testament and don't cite the authors of the Gospels. And then I don't know of the inverse offhand, but I'm sure I'm sure it happens.
All right. And a response from you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. That's actually not an angle that I looked at when I was kind of doing, the research for my rebuttal. Suffice to say, my primary objection is going to be, I think it's an argument from silence with, the qualifications I made in the case of Justin. But I think that would be interesting and would plausibly at least cut out some of the examples that he gave. If JD is right about this, then we would have, significantly less examples, because I don't think you're going to be able to use an example of somebody who's citing scripture and not giving the name if we just know that that's what their tendency is, to do.
All right. Excellent. Okay. Round 2 for Zachary here. So for Kevin, would it be better, in your opinion, to have absolute evidence of one gospel and its writer, or 4 gospels as we have them today?
Better for what? Like better evidence for the resurrection or something?
I suppose let me just go ahead and take the liberty of adding some clarity on this. So Zachary, I'm sorry if this isn't the angle that you wanted to take on this, but as far as historical reliability,
I think that if we had one gospel that started the way that like the Pauline epistles did, or the histories of Herodotus or whatever, I think that would probably do more needle moving for me than having 4 gospels like we have today. Probably it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to say, what would your beliefs be if things were different? It's kind of, you know what I mean? It's kind of hard to knowing thyself is one of the hardest things that you can endeavor to do. So my very tentative answer for you is I think that for me, the needle would move more if we had one gospel that was very unambiguously written in the style of an epistle where they name who they are in the first sentence. But that's just me. So is it better, objectively better? I don't know, but would it do more needle moving for me? Yeah, it would do more needle moving for me if there was one really solid one rather than 4 less solid ones. But that's just me. And also I don't know myself perfectly. So only take that answer for whatever it's worth.
All right, cool. Dave, and a response?
Not only is knowing yourself hard, but knowing yourself counterfactually is even harder. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The question's kind of vague because I'm not sure what it means by better there. But it seems clear to me that, yeah, it's going to be, in any sense of, reliability, resurrection, whatever, it's going to be better to have absolute evidence for 4 gospels over just one.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, before I move on to the next question, so especially for the 18 of you who are alive right now, Braden, the catechumen, texted me during this debate. His wife's water just broke, so everybody pray for Braden's wife and their impending baby. So yeah, but anyway, so Braden and Mrs. the catechumen, congratulations, and hope everything goes well. So, all right. So now we've got the other Paul is asking. So, Dave, I'm going to let you go first on this one. Question for both. Have you gents considered these 2nd century witnesses to John's gospel? Theophilus of Antioch, Ptolemy, a Gnostic to Flora, and Polycrates to Victor. I'm not familiar with any of those, so Dave, go ahead.
You just say it polycrates. I mean, that's hilarious. No,
Polycrates, let's go.
I'm just thinking of like the Bill and Ted when they talk about like Socrates and they call him like Socrates. Anyway,
Yeah.
These are ones that I've like done a little bit of research on, kind of in my studies of the patristics, but I don't think that these are names I've come across as much. Most of my studies have focused on primarily Papias and Irenaeus, since I understand it. These are our two earliest witnesses.
Okay, Kevin.
And then my answer is likewise not really. So my quick Google foo says that Theophilus of Antioch was writing in like the 180s. So that already like kind of puts him, just like Dave said, kind of like later. It was certainly later than Papias and like kind of a contemporary of Irenaeus. But once you get to Irenaeus, I'm already on board anyway. So at least for Theophilus of Antioch, that might not do a whole lot. And I haven't looked at any quotes in particular. And then for Polycrates and for Ptolemy, I don't know. So I haven't looked into them. So have you gents considered them? No, I haven't considered them. And that's not because I have an agenda against them. It's just because I'm a big dummy. And that's it. I'm just a big dummy.
Okay, all right. And if nobody takes anything else away from this, just know that Kevin is a big dummy. Okay. All right. So one of my favorite guys on the planet, Swan Sona of Intellectual Catholicism, is asking, and Dave, you're up first on this one. Or no, excuse me, Kevin, you're up first on this one. What do they believe about the reliability of testimony within living memory? Would such a memory be uniquely reliable?
So this question is phrased interestingly, as any question that Swan asks is going to be. Uniquely reliable? I'm not sure exactly what uniquely reliable means. So I think we're all probably aware of the problems with like the problems with eyewitness testimony. Like there's been tons of studies done where like you're not going to remember like little details and stuff like that, and you're going to have false memories and all that good stuff. I'm not like super concerned with all that stuff because like that's all we got for the first century. You know what I mean? So like if people are reporting like events in Jesus's life, I'm with Dave where I think that Jesus probably did say that weird vine thing that Papias records. Like in lack of any other evidence, I'm going to think that Jesus really did say that 1,000 vine saying. And that probably came from like living memory. They probably came from like some kind of oral tradition that Papias was writing down. And I think it's reliable enough that it convinces me that Jesus probably really did say those words. But like uniquely reliable, I'm not entirely sure what uniquely reliable means. Yeah, sorry for like a really crappy answer, Swan, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. All right, Dave, what you got?
I presume that by uniquely reliable, he means like more reliable than testimony would be that's outside of living memory. And I mean, on that, it seems the answer is not like a guaranteed yes, but generally speaking, I mean, yes, testimony that is from within living memory of an event is going to be more reliable than testimony which is not, because problems with memory, notwithstanding, at least there is memory in this case, whereas if it's outside of living memory, there is not memory. There's just memory of memories. And so any problems that memory have are going to be compounded as time moves on, in the absence of, certain correctives and stuff. So, I mean, generally speaking, I would say, yes, I believe that testimony within living memory is reliable with qualifications, and that will be uniquely reliable in comparison to memory, testimony, which is outside of living memory.
Okay, excellent. Okay, not a serious question, but for Kevin, you think the Gospels are anonymous? Name every non-author. So
okay, I did it. We're done.
All right, cool. You heard it here, folks. The Gospels were actually never written. But anyway, Okay, so James Andrew Lewis, which shameless plug for my own channel. I actually just recently interviewed him on my channel, documenting his journey to his conversion story. So check that out if you want. But this may not be germane, but here it is anyway. Does the idea of a pseudonymous authorship strengthen the Catholic position because it necessitates the one church as the authority? Kevin, go.
My answer might surprise you, and while I'm not going to say that it like strengthens the church's position, I will say that I don't think that the anonymity of the Gospels is like a stumbling block for Catholics at all. The reason I say that is because the literal Catholic Encyclopedia, which was put together by a team of archbishops and like theologians, calls the Gospels anonymous. My absolute favorite New Testament scholar is Father Brown, and he argued that the Gospels were anonymous. I actually, in one of my appendix slides, I have what's that book by Pope Benedict, Jesus of Nazareth. In Jesus of Nazareth, Pope Benedict XVI says that he doesn't know who wrote John. Then he lays out the arguments for why he thinks it's John the Apostle. But he cites all the different Johns who might have written John, like John of that island, oh my gosh, whatever, or John the Elder, because John the Elder might not be the same as John the Apostle. So like, and the quote that I pulled from Jesus of Nazareth is that like the authorship of John is shrouded in great mystery. Like that's what Pope Benedict XVI said. So while I don't know if the anonymity of the Gospels strengthens the church's position, I think that the anonymity of the Gospels is not a stumbling block for Catholics, like in the slightest. Like I think that if you interviewed like most like orthodoxly Catholic scholars, just by the law of like numbers, like most of them are going to hold that the Gospels are anonymous, and I don't think that makes them worse Catholics for it. Now I say all this as an ex-Catholic, so take all that with a grain of salt, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, Dave, what are your thoughts?
I think the epistemic channeling is going to be relevant here. So it's going to be relevant to how you are getting to your conclusion, sort of in the Catholic Church's authority in the first place, right? Because if you're getting there via a non-historical route, right, maybe you think you have some other kinds of like a priori justifications or something for being Catholic in the first place, then I'm going to agree with Kevin. Authorship of the Gospels isn't really going to affect you that much. On the other hand, though, from conversations I've had with Swan and other people, the way that their arguments for the papacy, for church authority, largely depend on the substantive historical reliability of the New Testament. And I think Kevin and I are both going to agree that the question of the authorship of the Gospels is incredibly relevant to that underlying conversation. So if if we agree that it's evidence against reliability, not decisive evidence, but if it's some kind of evidence against the trustworthiness of the Gospels, if we don't know who wrote them, and if your case for Catholicism, your reasons for being Catholic, depend critically upon the case for the historical reliability of the New Testament, then you can't say that gospel trustworthiness can take a hit from anonymity, but that your Catholic beliefs can't. That's not how evidence works.
All right, excellent. So sorry, I meant to star that last question, not put it up on the screen. But the final 2 questions that we're going to ask are actually from the same guy. So Nick Storligo, and I sincerely apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name. Wouldn't the just an example strongly cut against your agreed definition on anonymity that the authors are unknown? You would have to shift goalposts. So Dave, go ahead.
Oh, first of all, I hope that last name is pronounced Storligo. Oh, that would be like the most awesome pronunciation of that last name ever. But yeah, I think that this is actually a point I kind of wanted to push Kevin on, so I'm interested to hear what his answer is. Because if these memoirs are being attributed to the apostles, unless you're going to interpret that in some really broad, nebulous sense, and to the extent that Judas is definitely, no, that limits it to 11 possible people, that can be the sources of these Gospels. Justin uses memoirs and gospels interchangeably in places. So that really does cut it down. It's going to be difficult, I think, to maintain a sort of robust anonymity. I mean, at best, you're going to be like, well, Justin doesn't know which apostle, but like you've still got it, cut down to 11 different people. How anonymous is that really? So I am interested to hear what he has to say.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't think that the referring to them as the memoirs of the apostles necessarily means that Justin is referring to it's got to be one of the 11. I mean, right? We have the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark. So, like, evidently, he's referring the memoirs of the apostles to refer to those texts as well. So, like, I don't think it's quite as clean cut as that. And I also kind of view Justin Martyr as, like, we see this evolution of the way that the Gospels are referred to. Like, clearly before 150, we have the Gospels only being referred to as the words of the Lord or the words of Jesus or something like that. After that, from like 150 to 170, that's the Justin Martyr era, where we see them being referred to as the memoirs of the apostles. And then after that, we get specific apostles, and then beyond the 11 as well. So I think that Justin is probably an example of like the evolution of how we referred to the Gospels over time. And then just one more note about Justin as well is it's clear that the memoirs of the apostles that he's citing from is not the same as the Gospels that we have today, though they would be similar. And the reason I say that is because Justin Martyr cites the story of Jesus baptizing people in the River Jordan, but the River Jordan catches on fire while Jesus is baptizing people. That doesn't happen in our Synoptic Gospels. So what Justin is referring to as the memoirs of the apostles is similar but different than the Gospels that we have. This kind of all goes back to that proto-gospel kind of idea where like we seem to have evidence of like this loose amalgamation of gospels that kind of slowly turn into the gospels that we know and love today. So yeah, so much more could be said here. I'll have to leave it there for now.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So next question from Nick Stroligo. And he gave me the pronunciation key in the chat, so hopefully that's more accurate. How do you account? And then so Kevin, you're up on this one. How do you account for a nearly unanimous authorship by church fathers? Hebrew had like 5 different authors assigned to it. How do you explain near unanimity to supposed anonymity?
I might not entirely understand the question, but Dave and I both agree that Hebrews is anonymous. Early church fathers did attribute Hebrews to different people. So like Jerome argued pretty fiercely that Paul wrote Hebrews, but Jerome was also writing like 400 years after Hebrews. Well, not 400 years, but he was writing 300 whatever years after Hebrews was written. So like I don't particularly put too much stock in what Jerome thinks, like who wrote Hebrews. And I think that Hebrews is like the most obviously anonymous book of the New Testament. And then I think a bunch of the other books of the New Testament, like this wasn't a debate on who wrote Second Peter, but I think that Second Peter is probably the second most obviously anonymous book of the New Testament. And the Gospels, I argue, are anonymous, but just less obviously so than Second Peter and less obviously so than Hebrews. So I think we're all in agreement here already, I think.
Gotcha. All right, Dave?
The way I'm interpreting it is he's basically saying, how do you explain the Gospels, which you're saying are supposedly anonymous, being attributed to the same people, whereas, Hebrews gets attributed to a bunch of different people. In other words, why the asymmetry if both are anonymous? He's looking for an explanation of why we have unity with one and disagreement with the other if both have come from the same category.
Yeah. Do you mind if I address that question then? Because I didn't answer that question at all.
yeah. And he's giving further clarifications in the chat. So if y'all want to click over to the comments, so yeah, that way you can answer the question better. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think first I would start off by pushing back somewhat on the premise. In particular, I want to look at the Gospel of John. The authorship of the Gospel of John from the beginning was debated. So the Apostolic Fathers aren't at all on the same page as to who wrote the Gospel of John. John the Apostle, John the Elder, John of Patmos. It's not at all obvious that these Johns are different people. And in fact, Eusebius quotes Papias as referring to both John the Elder and John the Apostle in the same sentence. So those two people are clearly not the same people. And Papias thought that the Elder wrote the Gospel according to John, where tradition today holds that it's John the Apostle who wrote. So a lot of people will argue that Papias is wrong. And like, that's fine if you do. But my whole point here was to say that it's not as obvious, at least for John. Like it's not as unanimous as you might think. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, though, yeah, I've never really heard, I've never heard serious people put forward the idea that anybody else besides Matthew, Mark, or Luke wrote Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Everybody's either on the anonymous or the traditional authorship side for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So for those, I'll answer the question for them. I do think it's sign that there was a strong tradition associated with them. I just think that the evidence of the 100 years worth of church fathers treating them as anonymous works is just like a heavier chip on the scale than the fact that these traditions seemed to be really strong, if that makes sense.
Can I make a response to what he said about John?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So nobody that I'm aware of actually disagrees that John the Apostle is the author of the Gospel of John, up until Eusebius, who tries to make this distinction between John the Apostle and John the Elder. He tries to do that from Papias' words. I think that Eusebius' argument there is, I can't say the word I want to say, but it's bad. I think that Papias is very clear that John the Apostle and John the Elder are the same person. And the only reason Eusebius disagrees with this is because he doesn't agree with Papias' millennialism. So he doesn't want that to have any apostolic credibility. This is why he takes the time in Ecclesiastical History 339 to try to basically show that Papias, no, he's not talking about John the Apostle, he's trying to talk about John the Elder. That's where we get it from. Like, people like Irenaeus are clear that Papias, he knew John the Elder, right? Prior to Eusebius, nobody disagrees with this. Everyone thinks John the Elder, John the Apostle are the same person up until Eusebius. And Eusebius is clearly ideologically motivated to do this. And I think that the arguments, the words he cites from Papias actually serve to undercut the very point he's trying to use them to prove. I wish I could give the details of that, but we don't have time for it. But I will say, I don't think there is any disagreement about it up until Eusebius, which is like hundreds of years later.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for your response. Nick, one piece of advice that I would give you is that Kevin is a remarkably friendly and responsive guy. So if you want to have this conversation further with him, feel free to email him on the About page on his channel. And I know for a fact that he'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. Dave is obviously very busy with his important work with Dillard's, so I'm not sure how responsive he would be. So anyway, all right. Yeah. So anyway, that's all the time that we have for Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and put David away for now and myself away. So Kevin, if you want to go ahead and get your closing statement out, I'll go ahead and start hold on, let me get the timer actually prepped here. Okay. I forgot what was the format
minutes?
for the 5 minutes? Yeah, 5 minute closing. Yeah. Okay. So I'll get started as soon as you start talking. Oops, put the wrong guy away.
Oop, that's all right. I won't even need the full 5 minutes. Today, I did the best that I could to present what is the majority scholarly opinion at this moment in history, the anonymity hypothesis for the authorship of the canonical Gospels of the New Testament. The majority of scholars are in agreement that traditional titles were not affixed to the Gospels during the first century or the first half of the second century. The same scholars are likewise convinced that those titles were affixed to the Gospels by the end of the second century. The date that I've been using this evening is 170 AD, and that's just an estimate. I'm not married to that date, and I wouldn't be surprised if I updated my views, perhaps shifting 170 earlier or later, but I mean, probably earlier since I'm, debating with Dave, as I reflect upon this evening's debate. In fact, I'd be upset if I didn't update any of my views after this evening's debate, because then that would mean that I came away with nothing. And then what's even the point of doing debates, But in terms of the hypothesis that the Gospels circulated anonymous for nearly a century, I do think that the evidence is just too strong to maintain the traditional authorship view. The evidence of the Church Fathers who wrote in the years 155 AD and earlier is very strong by my lights. The internal evidence adds some weight to the anonymity thesis. The synoptic positive language, the dating issues all favor the anonymity side, though much less so than the attestation of the Apostolic Fathers. And if I'm being honest, this picture is not at all to scale. I just kind of tried to draw something in Microsoft Paint real quick. Like the thing that by my lights does like 80% of the lifting for the anonymity case is the Apostolic Father attestation. So like the thing that says Church Father on the anonymity side should be like 80% of the total mass on the anonymity side. But you get the idea. It's just a picture. Don't read too much into it. When we look at only that data, the 80% that I'm talking about, we see the Didache, Polycarp, Clement, Justin. And we also see Ignatius on the anonymity side. And then on the traditional side, we kind of just have Papias. And I don't think that Papias is talking about our Matthew and our Mark anyway. So I just view this as the scales being tipped in favor of anonymity. In a debate like this, there's like a trillion things that Dave and I could have talked about. And I would have loved that because like I love talking about this stuff. And Dave is like such a good resource for me to talk to. But I just picked my like top 3 most like pertinent works that I think are really good. And I can share these with anybody who wants them in case anybody wants one. So just reach out to me if you want a copy of any of these books. In particular, An Introduction to the New Testament by Father Raymond Brown is my absolute favorite work on like New Testament scholarship. And it's by a Catholic priest and it bears the nihil obstat. So for all the Catholics in the audience, there's nothing to be like, I almost said there's nothing to be afraid of. And that's definitely not the phrase that I want to use. No Catholic should go into An Introduction to the New Testament by Father Raymond Brown with any kind of like trepidation. Father Brown was a priest who died a priest in good standing. So that's enough of that. Okay, so my last slide. I would like to end the debate on this note. Dave is nothing short of a trad authorship king. Yes, Dave is crushingly intelligent and devilishly handsome. He has demonstrated both of those to my satisfaction this evening. But more importantly, and I mean this in the best way possible, Dave is a skeptic. I know that that word skeptic sometimes carries negative connotations in Christian circles, but I call myself a skeptic. And so if I call Dave a skeptic too, then you know that it comes from a good place because I love myself and I call myself a skeptic. So Dave disagrees with everybody around, everybody. I'm being a little hyperbolic here, but Dave disagrees with the majority scholarly opinion, and that makes him a skeptic. When everyone all around Dave is getting all mad at Dave for daring to question the orthopraxy of modern textual criticism of the New Testament, Dave questions anyway. That is exactly what it means to be a skeptic. I admire that about Dave, and I hope to emulate that myself. That's it for me. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I had an absolute blast, and I hope we can have future conversations just like this one.
Okay, excellent. Alrighty. Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to put you away now. All right, Dave, I will go ahead and start the timer whenever you start talking.
Gosh, now he got me all buttered up for this. Now I don't want to be harsh. Okay.
No, be harsh.
I have some stuff written up here for my closing statement, but just I think I have time to just address one further thing that I didn't get to address before, so I'd like to address now. And that was kind of the response that Kevin brought up on the issue of manuscripts. It was like, well, I don't really care about these manuscripts because look, they're all later than this 170 date that I care about. And while that's a fair point, I think the point to re-emphasize here is that even these 3rd and 4th century manuscripts, they're copying from earlier manuscripts, right? They aren't, and it seems really implausible to me that they all just decided to attribute it to these people at that time. So what we're getting here is copies of earlier manuscripts, and by this point we've already got these manuscripts very widely spread out. It's very implausible to think that these all should have gotten attributed to the same people. It should have taken substantially longer than that point, unless you want to maintain this is happening in the manuscript tradition as well, that you've kind of got this gradual happening take place. But I think that that's going to you need a lot more time than that to happen. If you're suggesting that the names didn't stick until this 170 date, then we should still expect plenty of anonymous 3rd century manuscripts. And again, I reiterate, we don't have that. So that I think is the stronger version of the argument. And one other point to bring up, I think, is that, again, not citing an author is not the same as treating that work anonymously. So I wouldn't count these as evidential chips, the fact that the Gospels are sometimes cited without the names being cited. It would be evidential chips on the anonymous side if they were, saying, like Origen does about Hebrews, that, only God knows who wrote this. That would be evidence that they're treating it anonymously. But I don't think citing it without mentioning the name is. Since you recommended 3 books, I'll recommend 3 as well. If you want like a good popular introductory book on authorship of the Gospels, again, Brant Petre's The Case for Jesus is probably the best popular level introduction on that. Craig Blomberg's work is good if you want to go a little deeper. And then, of course, the absolute king of it to me is going to be Charles Hill. His work on the authorship of the Gospels is excellent. Okay. So throughout this debate, I've tried to critique the idea that the Gospels were originally anonymous. We've surveyed 3 distinct lines of evidence which challenge the anonymity thesis. We've seen that the Gospels always have the same titles that they have in the surviving manuscripts, which suggests that they always had those titles. We've seen that the internal evidence is consonant with the traditional attributions of authorship. And we've seen that there is early and weighty external testimony, which unanimously attributes the 4 Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Furthermore, I've tried to take on the challenges to the reliability of the historical testimony. And, I think that those challenges are wanting. So the evidence seems clear to me that the Gospels were attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because these individuals actually wrote them. I would like to close here with a quotation from Martin Moss, who said quite eloquently, quote, "Discrediting the early fathers simply raises the unanswered and indeed usually unasked question, how did they all come to be so wrong? In an age when martyrdom was an abiding risk, one would surely have expected the fathers to make very certain of the historical traditions to whose origins they had readier access than we do, and for belief in which they were prepared to offer their own lives, expecting their families and descendants to do the same. There will have been the strongest possible motivation to verify the facts and traditions of their faith from the earliest and most reliable witnesses, rather more so indeed than that which rests upon us from our detached viewpoint today. Hence, the arbitrary dismissal of the patristic witness raise considerable problems of human psychology and behavior, not to mention historical method, which, if ignored, leave the problem seriously open-ended." And because I have another minute here, and because Kevin was so nice to say so many nice things about me at the end of his opening statement, I'll just say I've really enjoyed getting to meet him through this debate. I'm getting to talk with him. He's, a very well-read fellow. He's very respectful. I don't get, any indications from him that, he's ever engaging in bad faith, and that, he just wants to have a good conversation. And I really appreciate debating with people like that, far more so than I do people who, just want to score rhetorical points. So thank you, Kevin, for being a charitable and fun interlocutor. And yeah, thanks so much for this debate.
All right. Well, so thank you both for your time. Thank you all for joining, for those who are presently watching live and in the future. So if you haven't already, go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe to my channel. Also, go check out Kevin and Dave. Dave, why don't you go ahead and plug what you've got going on? And then Kevin, I'll give you a chance to do the same.
Sure. So people can find me on YouTube through my YouTube channel called Faith Because of Reason. I just finished a series on the synoptic problem, and kind of as I was prepping for this debate, I also was concurrently working on a video defending the traditional authorship of the Gospels, which has turned out to be about an hour and a half long. So it's like a very extended version of kind of the case I presented here, but of course answering objections from people like Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier and such. So if people want to see that, it should be up on my channel in the next day or two. It'll be titled, Are the Gospels Anonymous? Or rather, Who Wrote the Gospels? The Case for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay, excellent. All right, Kevin, what you got going on?
Oh, just a whole lot of nothing. So if anybody doesn't know me, I'm just some random like ex-trad with a YouTube channel. So I just talk about stuff that, I like, hey, I'm not a Catholic, and kind of here's why. So I like to think that I give a reasoned take for all of the positions that I hold. Maybe my reasoning is wrong. And if it is, I want to, figure that out, right? I want to stop being wrong. And so that's kind of like the purpose of my YouTube channel. It's to have conversations exactly like the conversation that I just had. If I didn't start my channel, I would have never met Dave or had this conversation with Dave. So I won tonight's debate by having tonight's debate. That's really it for me. Don't subscribe to my channel. It's not that great. That's it.
Okay, you heard it here first. Folks. Don't subscribe to Kevin. Nick's Highlander, thank you for the last minute super chat, and for the rest of you,